A light breeze gently stirred the crown of a mighty tree, carrying away the whisper of leaves, and high in the sky clouds floated slowly, casting soft shadows on the ground. A young man, having settled himself on a thick branch of an old oak tree, lazily swung his leg in the air, allowing himself to drown in thoughts, while the shadow of thick foliage sheltered him from the scorching rays of the sun. Below, in a clearing covered in emerald grass, stood a girl, her hair gently blowing in the wind, her voice soft with urgency, as she called out to the boy named Gustaf, asking him to finally come down and stop hiding among the branches. The young lady, folding her arms across her chest and slightly frowning sternly, said that the father had been waiting for the boy for a long time and insistently demanded his presence, since too long an absence could cause unnecessary worries and even lead to discontent. The boy, full of thoughtfulness, looked truthfully at the girl, not rushing to react, because he was used to hiding among the branches of mighty trees, escaping from the bustle of the house, striving for silence, where his thoughts could calmly flow like a stream in the forest thicket. The nobleman, with difficulty suppressing a tired sigh, quietly said that he would definitely return home soon, although he was in no hurry, and his face, which reflected a variety of emotions, betrayed an internal struggle between duty and the desire for privacy. The girl turned away in irritation, exhaled heavily, closed her eyes, and crossed her arms over her chest, as if protecting herself from disappointment. After which, with a slight bitterness in her voice, she added that she had once sincerely hoped for a warm, trusting relationship with her brother. Gustaf, suppressing his usual stubbornness, reluctantly lowered his head, and was nevertheless forced to admit his guilt, apologizing for the fact that he constantly avoided family dinners, preferred solitude, and spent much less time with his family than he should have. But suddenly, as if fate had decided to intervene in the conversation, the boy unexpectedly lost his balance, and his heart sank when he realized that he was falling down onto the girl who at that moment was calmly walking on the grass, not even suspecting the impending threat. So the main character died tragically, unable to bear the weight of her own brother, who fell on her from a height. Such was the end. Sudden, absurd, like an evil joke of fate, cutting short her life in the blink of an eye, leaving only an echo of unfulfilled hopes. The aristocrat's eyes widened sharply, as if emerging from the darkness of a nightmare, and immediately realized that she was lying on a luxurious bed, drowning in silk pillows, and the soft canopy above her was slowly swaying from a light draft coming through the slightly open window. The little girl jumped up in panic, exhaled convulsively, looked around, and the heavy blanket rustled as it slid off her shoulders, revealing an elegant nightgown that was completely alien to her, but at the same time strangely familiar. The lady, still feeling the echoes of the horror she had experienced, slowly lowered her gaze, realizing that her previous life was left behind, and her tragic end, filled with pain and helplessness, involuntarily surfaced in her thoughts. The time traveler, having finally come to her senses, suddenly realized that she was now in the body of the novel's heroine, whose fate had already been decided, but this time everything could have gone differently, because now she had become a rich lady. This dazzling beauty was named Reine Romaya de Latzia, a girl with refined aristocratic features, mesmerizing green eyes, reminiscent of spring leaves, and silky blonde hair. She was the daughter of a stepmother, a woman with a cold heart and boundless ambitions, who, having married a duke, gained a position, but instead of becoming a caring mother, turned into a cruel mistress, sowing fear in the heart of her husband's son. However, the duke himself, a stately and respected man, did not even notice the true face of his new wife, because he was head over heels in love with this young woman, idolized her, surrounded her with attention, not suspecting that behind the sweet words there was a poisonous smile. Blinded by love and not wanting to waste a second, the aristocrat, without hesitation, entered the name of his young beloved into the genealogical books, officially making her part of his noble family, without any doubt in the correctness of his decision. That day, far from the luxury of the palace, the girl sat behind the wheel of a car, confidently driving along the busy streets, not even suspecting that her fate had already been decided, and this path would be her last. It all happened too fast. A loud thud, screeching brakes, blinding headlights, and then she was lying there, lifeless, her eyes wide and filled with terror, frozen in that last moment of awareness as the world around her went pitch black. But suddenly, against all logic, she opens her eyes again. Not where she expected, but in someone else's body in front of a mirror, the reflection in which irritates and annoys her, because instead of a kind and noble heroine, she finds herself in the image of the villain herself. The novel she was now forced to live in was called Eternal Love, a book she had written herself at the age of 15, without thinking about the depth of the plot, since at that time it was just a naive teenage story intended for young readers. The girl folded her arms thoughtfully across her chest, deep in thought about how to get out of her own creation, not wanting to be just a bystander in the story that she herself had written and predetermined. Her hand clutching the door handle reached out towards it with determination, as if intending to break free from these walls that had wrapped around her so tightly, like a prison not giving her a drop of freedom for her own choice. When she finally stepped outside her chambers, the world around her opened up to her in an unexpected light. Everything looked different than she expected. She realized that she was 7 years before the events of the book's story began, and overcome with anxiety, she grabbed her head. But suddenly, a loud voice, alien and unfamiliar, broke the silence, and the little girl shuddered. Frightened, her heart sank sharply, because the world around her became even more unusual than she could have imagined. It was her mother running to her daughter, with anxiety and concern, worried about her health, especially after she almost died in an accident that came as a real shock to the whole family. With a slight smile on her lips, Romeo tried to convince her mother that she was okay, and that Gustaf was not to blame for what happened, because his fall was accidental, and not intentional as she believed. In the original story, the woman gave birth to the Duke's second son, but after that, she began to make life difficult for her own boy, hindering him in every way, and it seemed enjoying the power she received by becoming the mother of his younger brother. Turning her back, the lady said angrily that the boy, this scoundrel, should have been brought up more strictly so that he would not become as careless and irresponsible as he was now in her eyes. His behavior was unacceptable. Romeo couldn't stand it any longer and intervened, asking her mother to be lenient towards her brother, even though he was younger, and suggested that it would be better if he were sent to the academy every morning so that he would learn discipline and responsibility. Inside herself, the little girl tried to convince her soul that such actions might lead to the best, because it would be a chance for the guy, and the evil stepmother would not be able to influence his fate if he received knowledge and proper upbringing. The girl continued her way across the marble floor, her little feet stepping quietly, leaving white marks on the surface, like little clouds in the endless space in which she and her thoughts were now floating. Eventually, the young man was sent to the Imperial Academy, accompanied by footmen riding in a carriage that rolled slowly through the gates, and this was the beginning of his new journey, moving away from home, to gain knowledge, and perhaps change his destiny. In the boy's hands was a suitcase with things carefully packed for a long journey, a symbol of his new beginning, a small but important step towards adulthood, and perhaps a better future. The girl standing at the window quietly watched her brother disappear behind the carriage, and a slight joy appeared in her heart. She could not help but think that he had escaped the tragic fate that might have awaited him if he had remained in the house. 4 years had passed since the lady had arrived in this new world, and then, one dark day, news came that her parents had died in a horse-drawn carriage, their lives cut short in the blink of an eye, leaving a void in her heart. The girl angrily clutched the paper on which was written the news of her parents' death. On that tragic day, they had offered her to go visit her brother, but she had refused. She was too ill to leave home and go on a journey. The house was busy with funeral preparations, and the weather was as gloomy as sorrow itself, with rain and dark clouds symbolizing the dark days that lay ahead for the family. The coffin stood nearby, as if a harbinger of the final separation from those she had once loved. Romeo stood among the crowd, dressed in a black veil, her face hidden behind the thick fabric, and her sorrow was palpable, as was the sorrow of the nobles around her. Among them was her brother Gustaf, standing in the uniform of the Imperial Academy, his eyes closed, hiding his sadness. Since Gustaf was the main character of the novel, with whom Romeo's fate was so closely intertwined, the girl decided that he needed to be lured to her side in order to ensure a more successful and perhaps happy fate for herself. Suddenly, the lady's attention was attracted by another voice, the voice of her brother, which, as if penetrating her thoughts, called to her. The tone was full of anxiety and concern, as if he was trying to awaken her from the deep silence that surrounded her at that moment. He noticed that his sister looked weak and was not feeling well, and concerned about her condition, anxiously suggested that she return home so that she could rest and recuperate without worrying about anything further. The lady nodded her assent to his proposal, and without saying a word, she turned away. She walked away, leaving her brother behind her steps, soft but determined, and in her soul there were thoughts hidden that she did not wish to reveal. The late Duke's home was a majestic and grandiose castle with many rooms and floors, every corner of which was reminiscent of the former glory and wealth that once existed in this place, but now remained only in memories. This mansion was a true work of art, created by the hands of none other than a powerful magician who once held a staff in his hands and cast a spell, turning a simple stone building into something magical and unforgettable. Magicians who possessed incredible power and skill always held their magic staffs in their hands, which served not only as a source of magical energy, but also as a symbol of their status. In the land of snowy mountains, a sage appeared, a man who managed to drive out the darkness and cleanse this world of dirt and evil, opening the doors before it to leave only light and purity as a symbol of a new beginning for the whole country. This door, painted a blinding snow-white color, shone so brightly that it seemed to be able to reflect the light of the winter sun itself, creating a mysterious aura of cold and grandeur around itself. The count who owned this fine property was known among the aristocrats as the Ice Wall Aristocrat, earning this nickname for his unyielding steadfastness, the cold determination he personified in this cold but majestic world. On his head was an emerald crown of life, sparkling with a deep green light, symbolizing not only untold wealth, but also the indisputable continuation of the ancient line of the Duke, whose roots went back to the very origins of this majestic family. The tree branch, gently swaying in the wind, symbolized hope for nature, and its renewal as an elusive harbinger of spring, ready to give the world life and rebirth again after a long winter hibernation. The emerald crown of life brought its owner a long and prosperous life, good luck, and was a real blessing, personifying the connection with the ancient forces of the family and providing power that could not be ignored. The girl sighed wearily because her mother had previously owned this magnificent tiara, but she had not used it for its intended purpose, preferring rubies, which in her opinion better suited her character and life philosophy. Gustaf was still a minor and would hardly have been able to take responsibility for the family because his inexperience and weakness in matters of governance were obvious even to those closest to him, not to mention noble deeds. Moreover, this indifferent guy, who did not notice either his duties or the duties of his family, will soon become the target of his tough and ambitious family, and his uncle, as the book progresses, will try not only to subjugate him, but also to forcibly marry him off to his daughter. Trembling with fear, Romeo thought about how she could have prevented her brother's death, because for her it became a personal task, realizing that her actions in the future could determine not only his fate, but also the fate of the entire family. The beauty also felt a terrible fear of her brother's bodyguard, who looked at her with anger as if disapproving of her presence, and this made her heart beat faster with fear when she felt his gaze piercing her back. Quietly, with a slight emotion, Romeo called her relative by name, trying to get his attention, and he, standing next to her, finally turned to face her, as if sensing her anxiety and desire to find at least some comfort at this moment. Pressing her hand to her chest, the aristocrat said with determination that she would always be on the guy's side, ready to support him in all his endeavors, no matter what this devotion would cost her. The man froze, his feet planted firmly on the ground, and his boots sliding slightly on the surface, ready to listen to her words and understand that she was truly ready to protect him despite all the dangers that could lurk in the future. Romeo, with firmness in her voice, declared that her uncle and aunt were going to make her the mistress of their house, and that now she would take care of everything, no matter how harsh this cold world was, with its snowstorms and piercing winds that could not stop her. Indifferently, as if not understanding where her conversation was leading, Gustaf asked what she was trying to lead him to with her words, and his gaze was full of doubt, as if he could not find logic in her statements. Romeo calmly explained that her plan was to return all of her wealth and title to her brother when he came of age, but for now she was obliged to fulfill this role, bowing in reverence, confirming her readiness for this difficult role. The young man, hearing such loud words, was silent, not believing his sister. His heart was closed to her words, and he did not understand what real intentions were hidden behind her behavior, even despite her confidence. The carriage rolled them slowly along the road, and inside the conversation continued between the guard and his master. The knight, turning to the master, asked what the lady who resembled a cunning fox in her behavior had asked about and why she had attracted his attention so much. Gustaf, without showing any emotion, calmly recounted his conversation with his relative, continuing to look out the window. His gaze was directed at the endless horizon, as if he was trying to find answers in the void, avoiding deep reflections on what had happened. He thought thoughtfully about his sister, whom he had finally met after a long time of separation, and this event left in his soul a lot of complex feelings and memories that he could not forget. At that moment, someone's hand confidently and calmly lay on the door handle, intending to open it. This gesture was full of determination, and there was a feeling in the air that something important was about to happen that would change the course of events. It was a lady who entered the room, confident of her right to assume the role of head of the family, feeling the importance of the moment, and her purpose began to tell on her thoughts. She understood that her words would now be decisive. Inside, other relatives were already waiting for her, looking at her with undisguised curiosity. They were all silent, impatiently awaiting her speech, because much depended on her words, and everyone was attentive to her every move. Romeo, feeling the weight of the moment, apologized to everyone for her lateness, holding back her inner anxiety, and with dignity assumed the role of the head of the family, turning her attention to everyone present who were eagerly awaiting her words. The people gathered in the hall, sensing the changes, stood up to greet her with respect, greeting the girl as the new head of the family. Their gaze was full of respect and admiration, because she became the personification of the family's strength and tradition. Romeo, feeling the weight of responsibility, swallowed hard. Feeling the weight of responsibilities pressing on her shoulders, her heart was squeezed with excitement, and her gaze trembled a little from nervousness, but she tried to hold herself with dignity. On her hand, like a symbol of the eternal strength of the family, sparkled a silver ring with a precious blue stone, which embodied the spirit of their family, a symbol of the fortitude, strength, and wisdom of their ancestors, passed down from generation to generation. Any other person who did not know the true name of the spirit and did not possess the ring that contained its power risked his life. When trying to put on this ring, he instantly burned alive, unable to resist the power contained in this decoration. Romeo became the rightful heir, taking over the legacy that had been passed down through their family, and all present, respecting her new status, acknowledged her authority by saying words of blessing and respect, symbolizing the recognition of her position. Irritation flared up in her soul, and she clenched her hands into tight fists, feeling the fabric of her black mourning dress pressing against her chest, making her think about the gravity of the situation she found herself in. An aristocrat standing nearby, unable to bear the silence, spoke up, suggesting that they get down to business, and quickly discussed the topic of the meeting, which seemed to have long since become obvious to all those gathered. Whispers began to spread among the nobles, and they held quiet conversations, confident that the reason for their gathering was obvious, for each of them knew perfectly well that the time had come to discuss important matters related to their common interests. Gustaf, standing nearby, nodded, agreeing that everyone present was aware of the situation, and it was obvious. No one could ignore the events that were inevitably going to happen. The nobleman, with obvious sadness and distress, hid his face in his hands and said with a slight strain that he was very sorry that his elder brother had left this world, passed away, leaving behind a widow whom he loved so much, and now their family was faced with an unimaginable loss. Romeo, without expressing any particular emotion, listened silently as the nobleman changed the subject to a warmer note and joyfully, almost solemnly said that she and not her younger brother should have become the head of the family despite all her youth. However, another man, dissatisfied and indignant, loudly objected, shouting that a lady who was only the adopted daughter of a duke could not, and had no right to become the head of their family, because their blood did not flow in her veins, and this was absolutely unacceptable to many. To stop the developing argument, Romeo raised her hand, attracting the attention of everyone gathered. Her gesture was calm but confident, as if she was ready to establish order in the room once and for all, and resolve this issue without unnecessary arguments and emotions. All the nobles, instantly noticing her movement, turned to the lady. Their gazes were directed at her, and a deathly silence reigned in the hall. Everyone was waiting for her words, because they understood that now she would have to take responsibility and show her strength and determination. The girl stood up from her seat, lightly slapping her hands on the table, and looking at those present, clearly said that she understood the concerns of those gathered, because her decision was not as simple as it might seem at first glance. Gustaf was certainly still too young to become a duke, and as difficult as it was to admit, much depended on maturity and experience, which he clearly lacked for such an important role in the family and society. However, the lady had previously promised that as soon as her brother came of age, she would pass on the title of head of the clan to him, with a smile and honesty in her eyes, which indicated her trust and sincere readiness to transfer power. The girl, looking at those present, suggested that the reason for this situation could be her blood, which did not correspond to all the traditions of the family, and extended her hand forward as if inviting them to talk or think about the future. Gustaf, without showing any emotion, and silently looked attentively at the outstretched palm, and taking it in his own discreetly hid in its shadow, hiding all his feelings in front of the family, who were again waiting for his decisions. With a smile, Romaya politely asked her relative to lend her the ring, confident that the request would not cause any problems, because she always knew how to find the right words to improve relationships, even in the most difficult situations. Gustaf became wary, frowning, looking at his sister with bewilderment and a little irritation. After all, this ring was his family gift, and now he had to give it to her, although this caused him internal contradiction and doubts. Slowly and with obvious caution, the handsome man began to untie the chain that held the ring tightly around his neck. He was not ready to hand over such an important artifact, but he understood that he could not refuse his sister's request. The ring was carefully extended into the lady's hands, the sparkle of the gemstone inside, as if symbolizing the strength and power of their family, was captured in this decoration, which in fact was not just a thing, but a part of their heritage. Calmly, with absolute knowledge of her situation, the girl slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling its cold metal wrap around her skin. She understood that, being in her own affair, her actions and words were already predetermined. The decoration glowed blue on her delicate fingers, as if symbolizing the magic contained in her blood and destiny, reminding her of the strength and responsibility she was ready to take on. The fire appeared with a bright blue flash, and the girl involuntarily recoiled in surprise, feeling her heart beat faster with fear. This moment was so unexpected and unusual that her reaction was completely natural. The aristocrats around, seeing what was happening, began to whisper among themselves in complete bewilderment and shock, unable to understand how a stranger alien to their blood could calmly put on such an important family heirloom without dying from its power and danger. Gustaf was also deeply shocked, his face showing absolute bewilderment, his mouth and eyes wide open, trying to comprehend what was happening, unable to believe that his sister had seemingly survived such a powerful ordeal. Feeling anxiety creeping up on him, he grabbed his sister's wrist, worried, trying to understand what exactly had happened and why, despite all the danger, she remained unharmed. He was full of questions to which he could find no answers. The good lady, however, remained calm and self-assured, and commanded the spirit of the stone to be at peace, urging it not to be angry or make noise. The woman's voice was firm and commanding, as if she had long controlled this power. The fire disappeared, and the ring became calm. The blue stone glittered, but now without threat, as if the decoration itself had returned to its normal state, no longer carrying any danger or power. The noblewoman listened calmly and with restraint to the animated conversations and loud cries of her fellows, who were perplexed as to how she could possess the ring without being the head of the family. Their indignation could not shake her. She perceived their words as empty noise. Romeo closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and with a slight smile agreed with the words of others, not wanting to get into a pointless argument. It was her decision, and she was ready to accept criticism with dignity. Turning to the man, she stated with firmness in her voice that her rule would be temporary until her brother was mature enough to take on the responsibility and become the true head of their family. There was no doubt in her words. She knew what she was doing. Taking off the ring, she carefully handed it to her brother, demonstrating with her determination. This is a symbol of power, but its place is not on her finger, but on his, as the one who should one day become the true heir. Romeo, in response to the displeased looks of the assembled nobles, calmly explained that they could have not called her by her title, since she was only temporarily acting as the head of the family, and did not deserve the honors that were usually given to the true holders of the title. One of the nobles, a man with dark hair and deep brown eyes, who was watching the proceedings with obvious doubt and a gloomy expression, was named Wild. He seemed to disagree with her explanation, and was hardly ready to accept her decision with understanding. The other noble, a blue-haired boy with wrinkles around his eyes and fair skin, was known as Lance. His gaze was full of displeasure, and his mood did not reflect his agreement with Romeo's actions and her decision to temporarily take over the position of the head of the family. The third, a young man with long red hair, who stood silently and stared downwards, was known as the Illuminite. His silence and gaze directed at the floor only emphasized his inner doubts and uneasy attitude towards what was happening. The lady clearly felt beads of sweat running down her heated face, but despite this, she was firmly convinced. Wild could not betray under any circumstances, and Lance, as always, remained devoted to her brother, standing by his side with absolute steadfastness. A forced smile froze on the lady's face as she tried to find the words, but even now she could not say with certainty what the third member Illuminite was thinking, whose thoughts and motives remained a fascinating mystery to her, shrouded in the darkness of the unknown. When the protracted meeting finally came to an end, Gustaf remained in his chair deep in thought, his impeccable appearance exuding elegance and cool restraint, and in every movement one could read the nobility of a true aristocrat. Embarrassed Romeo suddenly coughed, realizing that she was staring too hard at the book's protagonist, as if this character had some special magic that made her get lost in her thoughts, forgetting about reality and losing track of what was happening around her. Suddenly, hearing her stepbrother's voice, she sharply raised her head up, and a radiant smile blossomed on her face, in which surprise and joy were read at the same time, as if this unexpected call filled her heart with warmth and instantly drove away all disturbing thoughts. The young man was constantly preoccupied with one question. How could she, who did not have the blood of their ancient family in her veins, not only have managed to summon the spirit of flame, but also survive this ritual without burning in the fire, which, according to legend, did not spare those who were not related to them by blood? The lady freely admitted that she had acted on pure risk, without a premeditated plan, relying only on luck and her own instincts, and this frank answer made the nobleman shudder, realizing how dangerous her reckless decision had been. The beauty explained without a shadow of a doubt that despite her adopted origin, she always felt like an integral part of their family, and never doubted her loyalty, knowing that she was ready to support him until the very end, no matter what trials it turned into. Burying her face in her palm, the noblewoman noted to herself that she still had to find the second main male character in this novel, and this task already seemed difficult to her, but exciting, full of surprises and possible dangers. Sitting in her office, Romeo hung her head down in frustration, staring lifelessly at the pile of documents laid out in front of her, reminding her of the endless amount of things that required attention, making her feel even more tired. Moreover, her life as the head of the family began not with triumphant victories, but with a painful burden, the payment of countless debts which had accumulated so much that they seemed like an insurmountable mountain towering above her, crushing her with their weight. That was why the lady decided to start with the ice wall mine, where, according to rumors, a huge amount of rare and valuable magic stones filled with mana were stored, a real treasure that could cover part of the debts. Pleased with her own clever idea, the noblewoman smiled faintly, feeling a drop of sweat running down her face. But this discomfort seemed insignificant compared to the satisfaction that she had found a way to get rid of the accumulated problems. The point was that ordinary magic stones had an extremely low purity level, which made their energy unstable and limited their lifespan, since after long-term use, they became dull and lost their natural shine. For this reason, knowing that the deposits in the Ice Mountain mine contained stones of exceptional quality with a high degree of purity, she understood. This was not just a rare find, but real wealth that could become salvation in a difficult financial situation. The hand with the pen froze in front of her face as the lady carefully signed the documents at the massive table, realizing that every stroke she made was a step towards restoring the power of their house, towards a new era of prosperity that she was going to build with her own efforts. Her thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a dull knock on the door. Someone whose identity remained unknown had arrived for a visit, and without hesitation made a sign of his presence, causing the lady to momentarily turn away from her thoughts and turn her gaze towards the entrance. It turned out that the unexpected guest was Gustaf, who, stepping inside with impeccable posture, greeted his sister in a reserved and quiet manner, not wanting to disturb the atmosphere of her concentration, but at the same time clearly intending to discuss something important. The noblewoman, noticing her relative entering, slowly raised her head, straightened her back, and gracefully greeted him, making it clear that she was ready to listen to everything he was going to say, no matter what the topic of their upcoming conversation might be. The young man, without wasting any time, came closer and calmly but firmly stated that it was time to return to the Imperial Academy, where he was to continue his education, completing the path he had begun, because it was his duty to their family and to himself. Romeo, slightly bowing her head, clarified whether she understood correctly that when his studies came to an end, he would certainly return to their home because their family needed cohesion, and his presence in the family was of great importance to her. Gustaf calmly, but without a shadow of a doubt, explained that he had to complete his studies as soon as possible so as not to delay graduation, and then without wasting any time, wished his sister luck as the new head of their family, leaving her with the responsibility for the future of the family. Romeo rose from her chair in irritation, her eyes flashing with indignation, and her voice firm as she told the young man to stop talking as if the spirit stone was rightfully hers, as it was a temporary position, and when the time came, she would return it to her brother. However, realizing the harshness of her words, she, slightly embarrassed, hastily added that despite everything, they remained a family, and therefore he did not at all have to treat her so coldly and formally as if there were no family ties between them. But the answer that followed was like a blow to her. The young man said without a shadow of a doubt that he had never considered her part of his family, and these words like sharp blades pierced deep into her heart, leaving a painful mark there. The loud sound of a door closing broke the silence that had fallen. Without saying another word, he simply turned and left, leaving her alone with the heavy thoughts that fell upon her with suffocating force. The noblewoman leaned over the table in resignation, feeling how the inescapable reality was squeezing her in a vice. When power returned to her brother's hands, he, without even thinking, would simply throw her out of the house, depriving her not only of her status, but also of the place that she considered hers. Leaning her head on her hand, the tired lady sighed deeply, deciding for herself that whatever her future fate, she should start putting aside money, now little by little, in case the dark fears did come true. The young man realized that in order to win the favor of the right person, it was necessary to carefully consider every word and action, so standing near the carriage next to his loyal guard, he was completely immersed in a serious conversation. Romeo, keeping a soft and warm smile on her face, followed her brother with a long, thoughtful look, watching him gradually move away while her thoughts were restless, because she was thinking about how she could earn his trust. At last, the horses began to move, and the vehicle, moving confidently from its place, rolled smoothly forward, accompanied by the dull clatter of hooves that filled the air, as if a harbinger of change and new beginnings. The lady, with genuine warmth in her voice, wished her relative that he would complete his scholarly work with honor, receiving excellent marks at the academy before his long-awaited departure, hoping that his future steps would be as confident as his aspirations. Gustaf, always reserved and unperturbed, allowed himself for the first time a slight smile, barely noticeable, but still obvious, which seemed to reveal his hidden feelings and emotions that rarely burst out, forcing those around him to see something alive and warm in him. Lord Ra stood nearby, his figure carved from stone with his hard features and brown hair, and in his hands he held a cane with an ornate horsehead tip which emphasized his nobility and determination. Despite his majestic presence, Romaya quietly spoke words full of hope that she greatly relied on the Lord's support and his help in her brother's absence, knowing that this experienced and steadfast man was capable of helping in any situation. The man, having listened to her attentively, bowed respectfully before the lady, expressing his complete readiness to provide assistance, agreeing with her request, and in his gaze, one could read the confidence that he would not let her down, despite the complexity of the situation. With her hands on her hips and determination in her eyes, the maiden headed off to her duties as the head of the family, realizing that there was a lot of work ahead of her because before her lay a whole array of urgent matters that required immediate intervention and resolution. On the table full of documents and papers, like an inexhaustible stream of business papers, there were many documents requiring signature, and each of them reminded of how many important decisions had to be made so that the family could move forward without retreating. The noblewoman, with a tired look on her face, sat at her desk, her head down, absorbed in thoughts of a long and hard day, because every new document or paper only increased the feeling that the burden of responsibility would never become lighter. The darkness that engulfed the room seemed to be her only companion at that moment, and the maiden was in complete shock at how much debt her family had managed to accumulate, and how she now had to clean up this chaos in order to save everything that was dear to her family. The women's fingers thoughtfully tapped on the paper, as if testing the rhythm of their thoughts, trying to find a way out of a difficult situation, because every movement of the hands was filled with uncertainty and thoughts about how to correct the mistakes of the past. The Duke's lands were vast and majestic, but hidden among the vast expanses were tracts of barren, uncultivated land that brought no benefit, only adding to the difficulty of managing these lands. The lady could hardly hold back her tears, realizing that without sufficient food supplies, they could find themselves on the brink of starvation if they did not start planting crops soon and provide the clan with the necessary resources to survive in the harsh conditions. After weighing all the pros and cons, she decided to divide the Duke's duties into 4 main parts, confident that in this way it would be possible to organize all the activities on the lands, and each aspect would be under control on which the fate of the entire economy depended. The castle, located in the picturesque mountains, looked majestic and impregnable, like a symbol of strength and power. And inside its walls will be full of life, because the managers will be devoted servants who will be responsible for the order and cleanliness in each room. In addition, for effective management, a person will be hired who will take responsibility for all the documents and papers, helping the lady in her difficult task, and will also become a loyal assistant who will ease her burden of decision-making. To ensure the safety of the lands and the castle, she needed to find knights willing to become a military unit responsible for defense in case of attack or other threats, and only such loyal warriors could guarantee the safety of this estate. In addition, a financier was needed who would take responsibility for managing financial affairs, but finding an honest person for such an important position was extremely difficult, since many were tempted by easy money robbing the treasury. Romeo, sitting at the table and staring at a pile of papers, realized with annoyance how difficult it was to find that very person who would not steal money, remaining honest and faithful to his duties, which greatly complicated her search. Turning to the Lord, the maiden asked him to find a worthy knight who could become the chief among others, lead all the armed forces, and whose qualities and valor would not cause the slightest doubt in their ability to defend their native lands. In the end, the assistant who would be responsible for all the documents and papers was chosen to be the maid Elizabeth, a woman with gray hair and intelligent eyes, who, despite her modest role, turned out to be extremely organized and reliable for such an important task. Romeo looked down tiredly and said in a heavy tone that given all their debts and desperate situation, they might have to sell off their lands and give up all their titles to try to somehow pull the family out of this financial hole. Those in the room recoiled in shock, unable to believe that their family was so deeply in debt that it now depended on every decision, every step they were willing to take to survive. The lady picked up the documents, clutching them in her hands, and broke the silence by declaring that all the previous papers were just a deception to hide the real state of affairs, and that in reality their financial situation was much worse than what was indicated in the documents. Taking pen in hand, she began to make calculations on paper, with concentration carefully recording all the amounts and obligations, trying to find at least a small clue to get out of this nightmare that had swallowed up their property and reputation. All the documents with expenses and income were in complete disarray, as if mixed up in a chaotic rush, and each sheet brought new alarming conclusions about how money was leaking out uncontrollably, leading their family to ruin. The noblewoman smiled slyly, making the important decision that they should definitely hire a new financier who would help sort out their affairs and also perhaps return their family to its former state if he was honest and experienced enough for such a difficult task. Standing up from her seat and walking around the table, Romaya continued her speech, explaining that despite all the difficulties, she also intended to go exploring the northern mountain range in the near future, looking for possible solutions that could help their family. The knight, hearing her words, froze in shock, not believing his ears, because the idea that the young lady was going to go to the cold and dangerous mountains seemed to him completely unfounded and even reckless. The girl calmly replied that this place deserved attention, because next to it there was a mysterious snow door that possessed some ancient power, and she was sure that these lands could hide important secrets that they were obliged to reveal. Hot tea was served, and the steam from the cup pleasantly filled the air, stimulating her appetite. But despite this, the drink could not refresh her mind, and she continued to feel tired, sitting at her workplace, absorbed in worries and endless affairs. Feeling fatigue creeping up on her, the girl tried to find strength in a cup of tea, but even this warm drink could not cope with the growing tension, which only intensified from thoughts about the future steps she would have to take. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to the voice of a knight standing nearby, who asked if she had sent a guard specifically to explore the mountain range, hinting that his absence might have been due to a desire to get rid of his friend, which seemed to bother him quite a bit. The man looked clearly displeased and even alarmed, believing that his friend might have been involved in some kind of dangerous adventure, and expressed his displeasure, not believing in the lady's harmless intentions. Romaya's head snapped up, listening to his words in surprise, as she learned that there really were monsters living near the door that she didn't know about, and this information came as a real revelation to her, opening up new dangers. After this, the lady laughed awkwardly. She thought it was cute how much the Lord was worried about his friend, and trying to dispel his worries, she hastened to assure him that everything was not as he thought, and that she had no hidden intentions. She remained seated in her chair, but there was confidence in her voice, as she stated that she believed in the knight's commander, and his strength, confident that he would be able to handle any difficulties that lay ahead. Frowning, the man added that it seemed as if Romea knew in advance everything that would happen, that her confidence and calm were somehow connected to the fact that she had information about the future. In fact, the lady was deeply upset, because despite knowing the future, she could not prevent the death of her family, and this helplessness tormented her, reminding her of all the things she could not change. The sunset stretched across the horizon, and the rustling leaves of the trees, as if playing with a light wind, added a quiet sadness to this moment, as if nature itself was experiencing with her something that could not be changed. Placing the cup of tea on the table, the maiden reminded herself that she intended to do everything to ensure that her brother suffered less than in the original version of the novel, because she could not allow herself to repeat the fate that awaited him in that world. The knight still doubted the noblewoman's words, even when she confidently stated that she had no intention of becoming family for her relative and interfering with him in any matters, because her intentions were much more complex and multi-layered. As the knight with his attentive gaze continued to stare at Romea, she, feeling awkward, turned away and decided to focus on sorting through the documents, trying to hide her inner feelings and cope with the moment. Suddenly, in this tense moment, there was a loud and insistent knock on the door, which broke the silence of the room, attracting the attention of everyone present and asking questions about what could have led to such an unexpected intrusion. The girl shuddered in surprise. Her heart froze, and despite her anxiety, the knight, immediately noticing her reaction, headed to the door to find out who was breaking into their office, thereby interrupting the moment of painful silence. When the knight opened the door, The girl's uncle stood in front of them, entering the office with a rather angry expression on his face, loudly greeting his niece, leaving her perplexed by his sudden appearance and the wariness in his gaze. The lady, without losing her composure, sat down in a chair at the table, inviting her uncle to sit opposite her, gently asking what had happened for him to come with such an expression on his face, as if the anxiety in his words and actions hid something important. The man briefly replied that before moving on to the main topic, he would first like to appoint a new guard for the noblewoman who would replace the old one, considering that the current protector was not coping with the task properly. Romeo was surprised by such words, and without hiding her bewilderment, asked what exactly her uncle meant, because she did not expect to hear something like this from a loved one, especially concerning her personal safety. The nobleman, repeating his words, insistently emphasized that the lady needed a real protector, and not a semblance of an old guard who could not provide her with the proper level of security, which greatly upset Romaya. Sighing quietly and looking at him carefully, the noblewoman confidently stated that she was quite satisfied with the current lord, who coped well with his duties as a guard and was always on duty without causing any complaints. The aristocrat, however, was not prepared to give in so easily, and continuing to insist, declared that the lady's mother owed him a considerable sum, and therefore he considered it necessary to take matters into his own hands, providing the lady with the protection he considered necessary. The man handed over a paper with a receipt in which the woman took a loan from a nobleman to buy a necklace, and her signature was on the document confirming the debt, which made Romeo extremely puzzled and wary. Romeo frowned as she read the contract, which stated that the amount of the debt to be repaid increased each month, and the longer she delayed repayment, the higher the debt became, filling her heart with anxiety and discontent. Waving his hand to the side, the aristocrat put on a sly grin, and glancing at his niece, said that since Romeo was his relative, he was considering turning a blind eye to this debt on one condition, which he would prefer to voice in person. The aristocrat continued to insist that he would very much like to become a real family, with the noblewoman giving her an offer that would put their relationship in a completely different, perhaps more advantageous for him, light. Looking at her uncle with confusion, Romeo said that they were already related by blood, and could not understand what he was getting at, because such words seemed strange and absurd to her in such a situation. The nobleman suddenly laughed loudly. His laughter was full of confidence and victory, and finally he frankly said that his true desire was for the lady to agree to marry his son, no matter how great the debt. The girl's face darkened. She could not believe her ears, and a feeling of disappointment and horror arose in her soul, because this son was Robbie, a huge drunkard and scoundrel who loved the attention of the ladies, causing pain to others. After all, this son was Robbie, the biggest drunkard and lover of girls, who led an unbridled life, preferring eternal entertainment and the attention that his carefree actions brought him without thinking about the consequences. The noblewoman, clutching her head in her mind, could not find a solution, sitting in complete confusion. She did not want to marry such a scoundrel, but at the same time, she could not simply refuse it, knowing how it could affect her family. Romeo, looking down in embarrassment, insisted that she could not marry simply because of her debt to a stranger, since such feelings could not form the basis for a future marriage in which her happiness would be out of place. The aristocrat tried to put pressure on her, reminding her that the amount she owed him was enormous, and that it was impossible to postpone the payment, since such debts required immediate repayment, especially given the severity of their consequences. Soon evening came, and their conversation dragged on for long hours, while the sky outside the window darkened and the light from the street lamps flickered in the emptiness of the night, adding an atmosphere of tension to this difficult conversation. The girl was surprised when the Lord Knight entered her office with a stack of documents, still as serious and focused as before, with an important mission that had to be completed immediately. The man, looking at his watch and realizing that it was already deep into the night, suggested that the lady rest, and that the continuation of the business conversation be postponed until the morning, since, in such a state, it would be unproductive and unwise to continue. The lady sleepily stretched, raising her arms up, and only then realized how quickly time had flown by, because despite her fatigue, her thoughts were occupied with important matters, and she did not notice how the night was gradually replaced by morning light. Romeo had previously ordered the guards that when they spoke with her uncle alone, he could eavesdrop on their conversations through the chimney to ensure the honesty of his words and intentions, which also served as protection for the girl herself. Coughing into her hand, the girl added that in this way, she wanted to get double confirmation from the guard, so that he would be sure of the need to maintain complete transparency, and therefore had every right to be a witness to their conversation. The knight remained silent at this, stunned by such an action on the part of the lady, because he did not expect that she would decide on such a risky step that could affect trust, but at the same time, he could not help but admire her determination. The Imperial Academy, being an important educational institution for the aristocracy, was established to provide aristocrats with the opportunity to receive higher education, nurturing them in the spirit of discipline and knowledge, so that they could serve the empire. The sound of footsteps on the marble floors of the academy echoed in the corridors, reminiscent of the grandeur of this place, where every sound seemed to be part of the integral atmosphere of school days, filled with knowledge and future decisions. From the very beginning, Gustaf found himself one step behind everyone else, feeling like a loner in a crowd. There was no room for close connections in his life, and he constantly felt alienated from this society. Thinking wearily, Gustaf thought about how tired he was of being a black sheep among other aristocrats, of feeling himself standing out from the rest. There were 3 great duchies in the empire, each with its own distinctive features. The first duke's family was renowned for their power over the ice wall, a majestic barrier that represented cold frost and brutal inflexibility. It symbolized their ability to weather any storm and remain resilient in the harshest of conditions. The second duchy was associated with the possession of white silver stones and metals, which were a symbol of their wealth and prosperity. The resources reflected the ability to transform even simple materials into objects of art and power, giving the family unrivaled influence. The third ducal family used white roses as their symbol, which signified their purity and nobility, while behind this was also hidden the spirit of courage. For the white rose became a sign not only of beauty, but also of the bravery on which they built their reputation. In the cold and gloomy mountains, where the mysterious white door stood, monsters lurked in the shadows. Creatures innumerable in number filled the icy expanses with their ominous presence, leaving only destruction and fear in their wake. The stern Gustaf despised the attention that was paid to him, as if he were not just an heir, but also a harbinger of a future hidden among the icy mountains, which filled his heart with inexpressible irritation and disgust. On the table, among numerous documents and papers, letters lay neatly, each of which carried its own meaning, and was intended to fill this moment with special significance. The young man carefully opened the envelope and slowly began to read the last letter that had been sent to him, his eyes following each line, trying to grasp the meaning of the written words in order to understand the true intention of the addressee. Finding himself with a letter from his sister Gustaf, noticed that she was eagerly awaiting his return. Her crooked handwriting still hadn't lost its special warmth that he could always feel when reading her words. Having finished reading one note, the man reached for another letter lying on the table. It was a message from his faithful assistant, the Lord Knight, whom he trusted and who was always ready to support him in any situation. Grabbing a pen and quill, Gustaf began writing a response to his friend, paying attention to every detail, knowing that every word had to be meaningful and precise to reflect his true feelings and intentions. After the day when he accidentally fell on his sister, she, upon awakening from her healing, changed her character and manners, dramatically becoming completely different from before, as if a new, more determined personality had awakened. Outraged by the amounts and debts filling out the paperwork, Romeo sat in her office, frowning and concentrating on reading the papers, not paying attention to the surroundings, absorbed in the problems that required immediate solutions. There was a cup of tea on the table next to her, from which aromatic steam rose, filling the air with pleasant notes, but even this soothing smell could not dispel the oppressive atmosphere that reigned in the room. The day quickly turned to evening, and the sunset slowly filled the sky with soft, warm hues, as if nature was preparing to rest. And the castle, standing majestically against the backdrop of this magical landscape, seemed frozen as if in a frame of slow motion. The lady, looking up from her work, blinked as her guest entered, his voice soft and solicitous, as he asked how she was feeling on this quiet and peaceful evening. It was Lord Blaine come to visit his mistress, and his presence filled the room with an unusual, slightly tense calm, as if he were not only a guest, but also a bearer of important information. Taking the cup in her hands, the maiden asked if the interlocutor had made any progress in the work she had assigned him earlier. Her voice was soft, but there was an insistence and expectation in it, as if she was ready to hear an important report. The man agreed, sliding his man gloves on his hands and handing her a basket, which, despite the top layer of fabric, was unclear as to what exactly was hidden inside, arousing curiosity and interest in the lady's eyes. Then, looking at his face, the knight added that they had not found a precious stone or crystal, but something completely different, something obscure, which filled his words with additional mystery and intrigue, as if the object itself was no less important than its discovery. The lady agreed with his conclusions, and said that she already knew about it since they had found a mana stone, a rare and powerful substance that would open new horizons in their research and could be the key to something greater. The knights were shocked by this answer, because the mana stone was an extremely rare element, and finding it in such quantities was almost impossible. The discovery seemed like a real miracle that could turn all their ideas about magic and powers upside down. The crystal they found was of a tremendous level of purity. Its surface was transparent and amazingly beautiful, as if the light itself was penetrating through its facets, illuminating everything around it, and causing everyone who looked to hold their breath in delight. The knight stared down at the stone thoughtfully, having only seen small mana stones before, and this discovery stunned him, making him think about the possibilities that would open up before them with such a powerful artifact in their hands. Happily, the noblewoman declared that this discovery would help them cope with their debts, improve supplies, and gain a lot of money. Her voice sounded confident, as if she had already seen how their lives were changing, for the better thanks to this discovery. With a smile, Romeo continued to thank the knight for his excellent work, acknowledging his efforts and professionalism, which further strengthened their cooperation and showed how important it is to trust in loyal allies. The man bowed politely, accepting the praise from the young noblewoman, his face expressing modesty, although inside he felt pride for successfully completing a task that could bring significant benefits. After that, Romaya frowned and, folding her arms across her chest, wondered where she could find rich clients who would be willing to pay good money for their valuable find and become her new allies in business. She decided to choose the Golden Rose from all competitors because it was the most profitable, for sales had a high reputation and provided excellent conditions for sales, which significantly increased their chances of success. After which she explained that this was the best choice, because rare magicians lived in the Golden Rose, and there one could not only find the right people, but also conclude profitable trade deals, which would open up new horizons for them. The man frowned, feeling that the lady somehow knew too much, although she should not have been aware of such details. This alerted him, making him think that her knowledge might not be accidental. In the original book, Romea accidentally found herself in the snowy mountains and found a white door there, which became an important turn in her story, opening up mysterious possibilities for her that would later play a decisive role in her life and destiny. At this point, when the disappearance of her daughter became a mystery, the evil stepmother blamed her poor adopted son for it, and everyone who was around began to hate him, blaming him for what happened, not knowing what really happened. Taking up a pen, the noblewoman loudly declared that she was going to write 2 letters, one for her brother and the other for the Golden Rose, planning to immediately resolve several issues that had long required attention. She paused for a moment and sighed, realizing that she also needed to find a second lead, which was no easy task, since each character in her plan needed to have their own unique role and key importance. The man she was looking for was a slave who would soon be forced to participate in illegal sword fights, and his fate became intertwined with Romeo's, creating unexpected twists in their future interactions. However, before moving on to other matters, Romeo wanted to protect her brother, because in 2 years, he would become the head of the family, and at that moment, she realized how important it was to ensure his safety and support him in preparing for this responsibility. The handwriting on the letter was terrible, and among the lines, Romeo noticed a phrase demanding that someone be brought. This was extremely alarming, because she knew that such orders did not bode well, and could affect more than just their family. Having received the message from his sister Gustaf, thought about it, because there was something important in the letter that could not be ignored, and he remembered that he had one free person who could be involved in this matter to help the family. His hand tightened on the paper, and he thought nervously about how the difficult situation with the lady, the head of the family, who was still young and had only recently taken on the responsibility of the family, could affect their future since she had important decisions to make. But earlier, Romeo said that she found mana stones shiny and expensive, which greatly surprised everyone since such rare finds could become the most important asset and change the position of their family in the world of magic. The guy squeezed the ring on his neck, playing with it with his hand, as if trying to find peace, and hiding his feelings, he squeezed it in his fist, as if trying to hold something important inside himself and not allowing emotions to come out. After this, Gustaf raised his hand to his lips and kissed it thoughtfully, carefully, keeping his gift of heritage safe, for he knew that this gift, if it fell into the wrong hands, could become dangerous not only for him, but for the entire family. It was a terrible dream in which everything around seemed unreal like fog, and people were only a shadow flickering in the background of his consciousness. Gustaf became the head of the family, and in his hands was heavy power. He passed the death sentence for his once beloved sister. The girl was pressed against the guillotine, her neck lying in the notch, awaiting her inevitable fate. The woman's heart was pounding wildly, and her eyes were burning with horror, as if realizing the hopelessness of her fate. The blade gleamed sharp and dangerous, ready to end her life in an instant, like a cold and merciless shadow that hung over her, ready to deliver its fatal blow. The lady was shaking all over with fear. Her body was not obeying her, and every breath she took seemed too loud, as if the whole world was holding its breath at this decisive moment when she realized that her fate was in the hands of the one who stood in front of her. Romeo woke up in her bed, overcome with fear. Her fragile heart was pounding, her breathing was heavy, as if she had just lived through a waking nightmare, and her entire body was shaking with a terrible feeling of anxiety. She closed her eyes in relief, feeling the tension slowly leave her, realizing that it was just a nightmare. However, cold sweat rolled down her face, and the thoughts that this horror could become reality still did not leave her. Grabbing a glass from the nightstand, the noblewoman took a sip of water, feeling how the cold moisture gradually cooled her parched throat and helped her calm down, restoring her lost control and giving at least a little relief. The traveler looked at her reflection in the mirror, and despite all her efforts, could not always recognize herself in this new body, which was now hers, but still alien. Both her feelings and memories were alien. When her mother was still alive and hugged her, the girl felt warmth and care. But now in this body, she only vaguely understood that these were not her parental hugs, but someone else's, like a body and life, that she took for herself, having no choice. The full realization that she had gotten herself into someone else's story came to her when Gustaf knocked on the door to ask for forgiveness, and that moment, like a bolt from the blue, confirmed her terrible suspicion. She was no longer herself. When the noblewoman, who belonged to an aristocratic family, saw the boy for the first time, she was in complete shock, not expecting to meet the main character of the book, about whom so much was said, and who turned out to be completely different from what she imagined. His face remained completely impassive, showing no signs of guilt or emotion, which only further confused and alarmed her, making her wonder what was hidden behind that cold mask. When his hands, carefully hidden behind his back, finally came into view, the noblewoman noticed bruises and scratches that seemed to be traces of numerous experiences, and this sight only increased her anxiety and desire to understand what was happening. It was the virgin author of the book who had created this young man, invented his fate and history, and now looking at him before her, she felt deep guilt realizing how her fantasy had brought down on him all this burden that he would have to bear. Barefoot and quietly, as if in thought, the lady headed towards the door, hearing her voice proclaim the joyful news that they had finally found such important and rare mana stones that could change their future. As she walked towards the open window, trying to think positively, hoping that all the difficulties were behind her, and ready to meet with the Golden Rose representatives to discuss the next steps and strengthen her position in this important matter. Unexpectedly clapping her hands in front of her, the aristocrat mentally turned to God with a request that the important business meeting would go well and that the contract would be signed, because this could change their future and destinies. The magnificent ice palace, with its stone walls and majestic roof, stood among the mountains like a sparkling jewel surrounded by pristine nature, which gave this place a special beauty and grandeur. Romeo was dressed in an elegant new white dress, embroidered with yellow flowers, and acted reserved and serious, knowing that the guests were about to arrive, and she had an important decision to make at that moment. Suddenly, Rebati appeared before her, a beautiful elf lady, whose dazzling beauty seemed to overshadow everything around her. And with a polite smile, she greeted the mistress of the house, uttering words full of respect and nobility. Romeo was shocked by the beauty of her interlocutor. Her eyes opened wide, and she could not hide her admiration, feeling how the elf in front of her was the embodiment of grace. Her appearance seemed to embody an elegance that could enchant anyone. Pulling herself together, the noblewoman smiled, and approaching her interlocutor, loudly declared that she did not think that the head of the Golden Rose organization herself would come to visit her, which was a real surprise for her, and a sign of great respect. The beauty politely introduced herself, and then slightly waving her hand towards the chair, invited the girl to sit down next to her. Her manners were so graceful that Romaya could not help but feel a slight admiration from her presence. On behalf of her family, the lady sent a letter mentioning the Mana Stone, which was believed to be so important to their future affairs, and now she hoped that this discovery would help strengthen their position and solve their financial problems. Upon seeing the artifact, Rebati was in complete shock, as was her comrade, who also could not believe his eyes. They both began to carefully examine this extraordinary specimen of crystal with surprise and bewilderment, unable to comprehend how valuable the stone found was. Romeo politely poured tea for her guest, her movements smooth and careful, emphasizing her respect for this visit, in which she hoped to find ways for further cooperation. Rebati smiled in response to the gesture, but deep down, she thought that her interlocutor should not be underestimated because she was the head of an important aristocratic family, and her influence could be decisive in their negotiations. Pushing the cup of tea forward, Romeo suggested getting down to business straight away, without wasting time on unnecessary conversations, since both ladies had an important goal: to sign an agreement that could significantly affect their future relationship. The elf smiled softly and kindly in response. Her smile was full of hospitality and warmth, like that of a hostess welcoming guests into her cozy home, ready to offer comfort and understanding to everyone who crosses her threshold. Suddenly, Romeo, with a determined look and a tone full of confidence, declared that she wanted to sell the monastones to the Golden Rose organization, which was quite unexpected, but clearly a deliberate move dictated by her plans. The woman, lightly pressing her hand to her chest, stood up from her seat, and containing her excitement, noted that her business relations had always been honest and productive, since they had done business with the late Duke more than once, and she had always been faithful to the cause. The lady thought for a moment and stated that she would like to receive 1,000,000 coins for a 6-month contract with the Golden Rose organization, which was a considerable amount, reflecting her serious intentions and calculations. The interlocutor hesitated when she heard such a large sum of money, and slightly confused, tried to explain that she knew nothing about mana stones and had no idea about the mountains in which they were mined, trying to save face. Romeo, without stopping her actions, began pouring tea from the teapot into the cup, calmly explaining that these stones were mined from the walls of the crystal, which made them incredibly rare, and therefore their cost was high, as was the demanded price. The noblewoman, waving her hand towards the door, coldly added that if her companion was not going to sign a contract with her, then she would not keep her here, as if demonstrating that she did not tolerate delays or uncertainty in business. The elf finished her tea, leaving the cup empty and carefully placing it on the table, looked at her interlocutor with slight interest, as if she was expecting a continuation of the conversation, which was clearly gaining momentum. Raising her finger up, the noblewoman finally agreed to the terms, but she had one important condition. She asked to make them exclusive buyers for a whole year, because in the end, her decision depended on this. She smiled and suggested making them exclusive customers for 1 year, since in the end, such a move promised profitable prospects for both parties ensuring a long-term relationship and a stable income. Romeo laughed, covering her mouth with her hand, a satisfied expression on her face, feeling deep satisfaction that the deal had been made, and her carefully thought-out plans had begun to bear fruit, confidently moving towards their intended goal. The guest, of course, demanded to personally inspect the snowy mountains to make sure that they were really mining mana stones, and was completely delighted when she saw the crystals sparkling like real jewels in the rays of light. The lady walking alongside agreed, noting that the crystal reserves were truly vast, and the high price they commanded would ensure that the wealth would be in demand on the market, ensuring long-term business success. Situated among snow-capped mountains, the palace towered over the surrounding landscape, its majestic walls and towers seeming to defy the harsh nature, giving the impression that it was built to be a symbol of power and wealth. The documents on the table were signed and stamped to confirm the deal, and the text of the agreement clearly stated the terms that both parties accepted without change. The noble ladies said goodbye to each other. One had already paid half the amount, and the other promised to give back later, when the income from the successful contract, which promised to bring profit to both parties, would begin to arrive. The guest, bowing her head in her green hat, said goodbye, with a slight smile. Her farewell was simple, but with a clear shade of respect, and without uttering a word, she quietly left the room, leaving behind only a slight rustle of fabric. The door slammed shut with a loud sound, and at that moment the room became silent, as if the air itself froze, creating an atmosphere of completion of an important stage, as if the whole world around had finally fallen into place. Romeo lay down tiredly on the sofa, feeling the weight of the day filled with endless business negotiations and difficult conversations literally dragging her down. She sank into a state of relaxation, enjoying the short rest that came as salvation. Her assistant, noticing the concern in her expression, carefully said that the beauty looked bad. She had clearly experienced stress, which left a mark on her face, which was noticeable even to attentive eyes. Romeo, smiling slightly, replied that if the woman came to her in person, it meant she had important news, and most likely this very moment could become a turning point in their business, opening up new prospects and opportunities for both parties. The girl immediately jumped up from her seat, sat down quickly, wasting no time, and began to read the papers that were brought to her, absorbing every word with increasing interest, trying to grasp the essence of what was happening. Moreover, the noblewoman, unable to bear the strain, began to bleed from her nose, the result of overwork that had become too noticeable and a clear sign of how deeply involved she was in the process. Time passed, night fell, and the ceiling of the chambers absorbed the light, becoming dark and silent, as if silence itself reigned in the room, filling it with an atmosphere of unknown anxieties and deep thoughts. When Romeo opened her eyes abruptly, she noticed that Gustaf was sitting next to her, calm as always, and at some point it even seemed to her that it was just a dream, because she could not understand what her brother was doing here next to her. Lying on the pillow and blinking slightly, the girl noted with surprise that the guy sitting next to her had clearly changed since last time. He had become taller and stronger, which could not help but surprise her, because time flies unnoticed even when it is not noticed. Romeo carefully adjusted the blanket, raising her hand to touch her brother, and he suddenly flinched, realizing that his sister had finally woken up, and a slight worry became visible on his face as soon as he realized that this was not a dream. Placing his hand on the girl's forehead, he checked her temperature and general health, knowing that she had recently lost consciousness and was in poor condition, so he carefully monitored her well-being like an older brother. The young man, speaking a few soft words with easy calm, reported that his sister had no fever, which meant that she had probably already recovered from her recent illness, and the anxiety began to gradually leave his eyes. How unexpectedly, Romeo made a compliment, noticing how beautiful her brother's fingers were, long and thin like a musician's, which immediately caught her attention because she had never noticed this before, as if it were a new discovery. Gustaf, with a slight grin, agreed that he did play the piano well, and promised to play for her one day, as if confirming his words with a confident tone, but remaining mysterious and inaccessible. The noblewoman, grinning at his rude answer, could not hold back her laughter, but continued to lie there, exhausted, feeling the last of her energy leaving, and her body, still not recovering from the recent fall, remaining weak and lethargic. After that, the lady added that Gustaf was too perfect. Her admiration was evident in her voice when she said that he was not only handsome and talented, but also strong, as if emphasizing that he was a multifaceted personality. Gustaf, however, sat there showing no emotion, his face cold and impenetrable, his gaze attentive, as if he was thinking about something important, but at the same time remained mysterious, which only added intrigue to what was happening. Sleepily closing her eyes from fatigue, sweet Romeo carefully rubbed them with her fingers, trying to drive away the growing heaviness of sleep. But the fatigue did not leave her like an invisible weight, not giving her peace, and making her feel weak every second. Finally, morning came, and through the window, partially covered with curtains, clouds could be seen slowly floating across the sky, and the sun's rays broke through the fabric, creating a bright spot on the floor that gradually filled the room. When the girl finally woke up, her ears caught a familiar voice next to her, and turning her head to the side, she couldn't believe her eyes, feeling how reality was slowly taking shape despite her confusion. It was Gustaf, who still remained by her side, guarding her all night, and until the morning, not allowing her to be alone, even in those moments when she especially needed the support and sense of security that he could give her. Romeo jumped up in shock, realizing that it was not just a dream, and that the young man was really next to her, not moving away even a step, confirming his care and attention, which surprised her, making her feel vulnerable. She had many questions filling her mind, but Gustaf, without waiting for her words, briefly told her to stay in bed, promising to call a doctor at once to check her health and make sure that everything was all right with her. A hand pulled sharply on the rope, and the ringing of the bell echoed throughout the house, summoning the servants to come and do their duties, filling the room with a sound that always brought order and demanded attention. The man frowned, his thoughts returning to the girl's words and her request in which she asked him not to kill her in her sleep, and he wondered, was she really afraid of him, despite all their relationship and circumstances? Romeo had tried calling her brother's name several times already, but each time his response was quiet and invisible, as if she was turning into emptiness, and the anxiety inside her only grew stronger from his silence and lack of response. Finally, Gustaf, with slight irritation, explained that he was simply passing by her chambers, and having decided to look in, he could not ignore her condition, that he was not only nearby, but also felt that her concern must be something important. The lady looked up in surprise when she heard that her brother had received top marks, passed his exams faster than anyone else, and graduated from the academy with honors, as if this success had come as an unexpected discovery, filled with pride to her. The noblewoman, completely perplexed, could not find words. Her gaze was riveted on her brother, and it seemed that she could not believe in his achievement, because this success was a real shock for her, as if her heart could not withstand such a surprise. Romeo smiled widely, her voice shaking with admiration as she said how incredible and amazing her brother was. The blush on her cheeks, a clear indication of how proud she was of his accomplishments. The noblewoman, filled with boundless joy and pride, began to clap her hands joyfully, and with genuine delight, congratulating her brother on completing his studies as the best of all, thereby expressing admiration for his amazing achievements. When the doctor arrived, he explained that the patient had overtired herself too much, which had led to her fainting, pointing out the need to pay attention to her condition and carefully recover from such a strain. With a smile on her face, Romeo responded to the recommendations to rest more and eat right, but soon admitted that she was unable to do so because she was overloaded with things to do, because her life was full of obligations and worries. The healer sighed heavily, fully aware that the girl was stubborn and did not want to listen to his insistent recommendations, despite the obvious signs of her overwork, which only increased his anxiety and concern for her health. The noblewoman sat down on the bed, full of determination, intending to finally get up and start a new day, feeling how every movement was accompanied by a slight tension, because her tired body demanded the rest that it so needed. Her bare feet felt soft against the carpet, and her thin ankles swayed slightly as she tried to stand, as if an invisible weight was reminding her how important it was to allow herself a little rest. With annoyance and a slight reproach in his voice, Gustaf noticed that the doctor had strictly ordered her to rest and not to get up, not hiding his concern, because he knew very well how stubborn his sister could be at such moments. Raising her head, the lady explained with determination that as the work had only just begun, she had no right to take a rest, believing that her duties required immediate performance, despite her tired state. Gustaf, not wanting to listen to her excuses, firmly placed his hands on his sister's shoulders and gently but firmly pressed down, forcing her to sit back down on the bed, clearly not wanting her to continue to be stubborn. Finally, the girl, no longer having the strength to resist, lay down on the bed again, her head touching the pillow with relief and a soft sigh, and her whole body was filled with the long-awaited feeling of peace and tranquility that she needed so much. The guy suddenly broke away from his thoughts and loudly declared that they had agreed that if he got good grades, he would return home and quickly become the head of the family, continuing his path to success and leadership in the family. The blush on the noblewoman's face became even more noticeable as she realized that her brother had indeed been in her room the night before, and her embarrassment was heightened by the thought that he had witnessed her vulnerability at that moment. Gustaf, without showing any emotion, confirmed that he had indeed visited her yesterday. Just to check in, his words sounded calm, as if nothing unusual had happened, and he did not attach any special importance to this visit. The noblewoman, feeling her face blush shyly, lowered her gaze to the blanket, feeling a shudder run through her body, not knowing how to properly react to this unexpected confession. The guy, not paying attention to his sister's embarrassment, stroked her head as if trying to calm her down, and in a light but decisive tone, ordered her to rest more, not forgetting to take care of her health. When the aristocrat finally left the room, the lady, feeling tired and incredibly embarrassed, laid her head back on the pillow, trying to get rid of the thoughts of how her brother had seen her weakness yesterday and lived through that moment in silence. Every year, their family performed a ritual that was an important tradition to protect the snow door, which was obligatory for everyone who was connected to this lineage and brought confidence in safety and prosperity. When the stepmother and Romaya joined their family, they also became involved in this event, understanding the importance of this ritual and respectfully joining in with a long-standing tradition passed down from generation to generation. Back then, when she was still little, Romia approached her brother with a cautious question, quietly asking if he wanted to join her on her trek to the door, or if he preferred to stay away, waiting to see how things would work out. And then, moving away from everyone, slowing down in his movement, the boy found himself guilty of the fact that, because of him, his sister had been lost, and the weight of this realization pressed on his shoulders like a stone that could not be thrown off. The strict father, who had hit the young man for the first time in his life, looked at his repentant face with anger, and in front of him lay a precious crystal, the mana stone once found by Romaya, a symbol of how their path was intertwined with this ancient source of power. The young man turned away, looking away, unable to admit his guilt, because he never intended to harm his sister. On the contrary, Gustaf always directed his anger at himself, trying to cope with his inner demons. With a heavy sigh, the guy returned to the documents that his sister had signed, realizing that despite her stubbornness, the deal was indeed good and profitable, confirming her reasonableness in this matter. He then handed the papers to his assistant, carefully checking that all the terms of the contract remained unchanged, and convinced of the necessity of maintaining honesty, he intended to maintain justice and obligations as previously agreed upon. Jenya's maid, slightly hesitantly, said that she was still looking for a financier for their family, trying to hide her confusion, because this issue was not only important, but also required an urgent solution to maintain stability. She hesitated, and then cautiously inquired about the lady's well-being, because despite all her efforts, Romeo was still in a weakened state after coming to, after fainting, and concerns about her health could not go unnoticed. Gustaf, closing his eyes in fatigue, explained that Romeo was simply very tired, and therefore fainted, emphasizing that it was not something serious, but still required time to recover and rest. The tea in the cup in front of her looked terrible. Its dark color and pungent smell seemed to emphasize all the discomfort of the situation. And against this background, even a hot drink could not be a consolation for those who were worried. Not particularly wanting to drink the strange liquid, the lady asked whether it was really necessary to take this medicine to the last drop, since the smell and taste made her doubtful, and her weak condition did not encourage her to feel better. Having taken the prescribed herbs, the noblewoman, barely closing her eyes, fell back onto the bed. But despite her fatigue, she could not fall asleep because her thoughts were occupied with something important and disturbing, which did not give her peace, although her body desperately demanded rest. Without thinking for long, the beauty put on her shoes and headed to the library, her steps on the floor with the dull sound of her heels breaking the silence, and thoughts were spinning in her head that she needed not just to rest, but to sort out the situation that was bothering her. In the library by the window stood kind Elizabeth, who, seeing her mistress, suddenly shuddered from such a surprise, not expecting a woman's visit, because her visit to the old library was a complete surprise for her. Romeo ran up to the woman, and with interest in her eyes began to discuss with her brother who had returned from the academy so quickly, and seemed to be busy with some important documents, as she assumed, although she herself did not know all the details. As soon as the lady froze, hearing a voice behind her stern and unyielding, which reminded that if someone dared to talk about him, it was better to do it right in his face, and not behind his back, the girl could not remain indifferent. Without wasting any time, she stood up for the maid, stating that she was absolutely innocent because she was only following her orders, and there was no point in blaming her for what happened because she had not the slightest fault in it. A few moments later, the servants hurried out of the room, and the young noble couple were left alone, finally able to talk in privacy without prying eyes that could interfere with their long conversation. The man, with obvious curiosity, looked at the noblewoman and suddenly asked her what kind of clothes she was wearing, because he had never seen her in such an outfit before, and this surprised him a little, making him think about the reason for her unusual choice. The girl, a little embarrassed, explained that it was comfortable and practical clothing for going to the library, but the young man, misunderstanding her words, took it as a hint that he was not doing his job well, and frowning sadly, asked if she did not believe in him. Romeo, noticing his sadness and bewilderment, hastened to correct the misunderstanding, assuring him that everything was not so at all, and that, on the contrary, she had immense faith in him. She apologized for allowing herself to discuss him behind his back and did everything to clarify the situation. The young man, grabbing her hand and feeling how she was shivering from the cold, insisted that she follow him because he needed to somehow warm her up and make sure that she did not feel bad at such a cold moment. Passing by his knight, who continued to follow them and leading his sister behind him, Gustaf ordered the senior guard to immediately light a fire in the fireplace to warm her and not let her remain in the cold any longer. He moved the chair with his hands, inviting his dear sister to sit next to the fireplace, assuring her that she would definitely not get sick because the warm fire would warm her and protect her from the cold, which could cause a cold. The fire burned brightly, emitting a warm glow that danced on its tongues like living fiery creatures, consuming the wood, turning it into coal, and leaving a cozy atmosphere around. The girl stretched her legs forward, feeling the icy cold penetrate deeper, beginning to pierce her to the very bones. With each passing moment, she became more and more aware that she was indeed frozen, without noticing how her body had lost its usual warmth and vigor. The nobleman quickly understood what was troubling his sister in this conversation, and turning to her, gently asked if she had thought about her wedding, since this might help to understand what was troubling her soul. Romeo sighed heavily, and after a short pause, agreed that her future husband, according to her uncle's will, was to become a drunkard and a debauchee, which made him a completely unsuitable candidate for her. The young man, quietly, with obvious interest, asked if the young man were normal, would the lady be able to agree to marry him, because sometimes circumstances can change everything, and even those who decide to take difficult steps are looking for paths to happiness. Upset, the noblewoman lowered her gaze to the floor as if trying to hide her soul, and replied that she did not have much of a choice. The debts had to be paid off somehow, and there was too little hope for a bright and good marriage to believe in anything better. The noblewoman sat upright in her chair, her gaze enchanted by the flames that danced slowly in the fireplace, her face illuminated by its warm tongues, looking as beautiful as if she had become part of this magical light. The man couldn't help but pull her towards him, gently touching the noblewoman's silky hair, with his fingers feeling his palm glide over its incredibly soft texture, and his gestures became more and more gentle. Romeo smiled, thinking that her hair was just tangled, and her brother decided to help her untangle it, showing her concern that she didn't even expect, because this was the moment when simple attention became so important. The guard standing near the door watched the young couple, surprised at how soft and warm his usually stern and cold master could be, because he was always so formal and reserved, but now showed such tender attention. The man looked away, embarrassed, and coughed, trying to hide his awkwardness from the behavior of the lady and lord, who behaved as naturally as if they were real spouses, and this only emphasized their harmony. They were chatting sweetly, not paying attention to those around them, acting like a couple ready to become spouses, and they would have looked like such a beautiful couple if they had really decided to get married, because there was such a sincere connection between them. Suddenly, Romeo turned to the guard with a slight smile, saying that he was lucky because his master had returned home, adding that this would perhaps bring changes in their lives that they had never even dreamed of. Unexpectedly, Gustaf turned to his interlocutor with a question about why she believed in him and his strength, as if he was looking for confirmation of his own doubts. And this became the moment when uncertainty broke through his confident appearance. Awkwardly, the girl replied that it was simply because the nobleman was himself, and nothing more, that there was something attractive in his simplicity and sincerity that allowed her to believe in him without even knowing how to explain it. She wrapped her arms around her knees, pulling them towards her, and as if trying to find the words, she began to explain that Gustaf was brave, solved all problems with courage, never gave up, and always acted even when the situation seemed hopeless, which made him special. The beauty smiled at the end, looking at the guy with a loving gaze, and added that this was exactly why she believed in him, and this was exactly why she liked him. There was something in his strength and inner fortitude that touched her heart and made her believe in him. The man sighed heavily, lowered his head, embarrassed by such words, and at that moment, Romeo, not wanting to console him, added that she did not like it when he overworked himself, because it only aggravated all his weaknesses, and she could not remain calm. Suddenly, the handsome man unexpectedly dropped to his knees in front of the lady, reminding her that of all those present, it was Romeo who often experienced overload because she always took on more than she could bear, showing concern for others. His manly hand rose slowly, his fingers long and graceful, gliding through the air as if they were part of the movement itself, and there was something soft and decisive at the same time in the gesture. And suddenly, Gustaf picked up the girl in his arms. She squealed in surprise, feeling how her body instantly became light in his arms, and he said that then he would help the lady to rest if she herself could not cope, as if expecting her to agree to his help. The guy promised that he would never drop his sister or let her go, assuring her that he would hold her in his arms as the most precious thing, and his words sounded with such determination that she felt her heart become calmer. On the way, the lady started a conversation about a lord named Illuminate, telling that his daughter, this noblewoman, was ill, and no one knew what kind of illness, which was a mystery, because of which everyone in society was worried about her condition. Gustaf, hearing about this, agreed that it was a serious problem, because if the disease was not diagnosed, it was easy to get sick, and his expression became more serious, and his attention to the girl's words became even more intense. When they arrived at the noblewoman's chambers, the aristocrat gently laid her down on the bed, ordering her to rest, as if to make it clear that her health and well-being were now a priority, and everything else could wait. After which the young man smiled tenderly, before leaving his gaze full of care and warmth, and after saying goodbye to his sister, he made sure that she was comfortably settled before leaving her in her chambers to rest. The noblewoman sat down on the bed, and feeling how hard the long and exhausting day had taken on her, she relaxed and stretched out, trying to get comfortable, so that she could at least take a short nap and gain strength before the upcoming worries. The bag was thrown to the floor with a characteristic thud, and its contents immediately became obvious. Money, or rather a debt with interest, which was supposed to cover all obligations and fulfill promises made earlier. The uncle, shocked by what had happened, froze, looking in surprise at the money that was handed to him, unable to understand how they were able to repay the debt so quickly in such a short time, which seemed impossible under such circumstances. Gustaf replied that he had not committed any financial fraud, but had earned it honestly, and now asked his uncle to return their mother's promissory note to him, since this was an important step for their future affairs and family obligations. The man thought irritably about how this brat had suddenly interfered with his cunning plans that he had been making for his sister, and how everything that he had so carefully hidden was now under threat because of his interference. He grabbed the bag with his hands, squeezing it, and not hiding his irritation, said that they should have stopped relying on the entire amount first, because it was too risky and required more attention to detail. And inside the bag lay large golden pieces of metal, sparkling and shining expensively, and their shine was so bright that it seemed that the money itself promised strength and power that could change many things in life. The nobleman picked up one of the coins and bit it, checking to see if it was really gold, and when he was convinced of its authenticity, he felt his heart beat heavily from the realization that he was holding a real coin and not a counterfeit. Indeed, he had in his hands not a counterfeit, but a genuine coin of their country, and this suddenly gave the situation a special weight because he could now verify the truth of their words and actions, which seemed dubious. The nobleman, feeling that the conversation had become too tense, decided to change the subject, and in a reserved tone asked where his niece was. He wanted to speak to her personally and as soon as possible, since there was something important that required immediate resolution and explanation. Gustaf looked away, his face cold and emotionless, and replied that if the man really wanted an audience with the noblewoman, he should have communicated this in advance, rather than trying to act hastily and without warning. The uncle, with evident irritation, exclaimed that being her near relative, he had every right to visit the lady at any time without needing her permission, and that this right of his as a member of the family was not subject to discussion. The guy replied rudely, without hiding his contempt, that even despite their family ties, the nobleman was still below her in status, and therefore such impudent demands were inappropriate and did not comply with the rules of decency. The man's hand clenched into a fist, and with each passing moment, the handsome man felt how rage was filling him, because every word of his uncle affected him like sparks in a fire, kindling anger and causing hostility towards his impudence. He held out the paper, and his uncle, noticing the growing anxiety on the lord's face, hastened to apologize, realizing that his behavior had been too insolent, and that in his hands was not just a paper, but a request for a meeting which he hoped to receive. The aristocrat himself, old and tired, sat down on the sofa, waiting to be received, feeling the weight of time, which seemed to drag on endlessly, because for him this meeting was extremely important and required a special approach. Waving his hand with slight irritation, he said that he would not budge until he was given an exact time to meet with his niece, believing that his status and family ties gave him every right to such a persistent approach. There was a soft pop, and the nobleman was left alone in the room, as if all his self-confidence had vanished, and the emptiness left by his words was filled with tension, making his wait seem even more painful. Gustaf, meanwhile, headed forward down the corridor, intending to pass on the note without wasting time and focusing on the task at hand, which had to be completed with the utmost care and determination. His master was followed, as always, by a knight who, noticing his thoughtful look, quietly asked his master whether he really believed his foster sister and what, in his opinion, she could hide or plan in such difficult circumstances. Gustaf, with a slight grin, replied what his old friend meant when he spoke such words about the lady, leaving room for reflection on how much this mysterious woman, whom he had always considered an important figure in his life, was hiding. The nobleman had long since changed his opinion of his relative when he noticed how much she had changed. She had become respected and honored, and now she was perceived by everyone as a worthy and authoritative person, which had not been the case before. Earlier, Gustaf promised himself to return to his home after he completed his 6 months of training at the academy, deciding that it was important for him to return to his roots and replenish knowledge that would be useful in the future. The surprised knight watched as his master suddenly quickened his pace and walked away in silence, as if something in his mood had changed and his thoughts were now occupied with something important that required immediate resolution. The maiden was sitting at her workplace when she learned that her uncle had come to ask for an audience, and on hearing this, she felt something stir within her, for she could not understand what exactly had prompted him to ask for an audience. Gustaf took the already signed documents from her and told her that her relative was waiting for her in the living room, after which, with the look of someone who knew what he was doing, he left leaving her alone with her thoughts about what exactly brought her uncle to her house. Sighing heavily and taking the papers in her hands, the girl thought about why exactly her uncle had come and what he wanted to talk to her about, because her mind was full of guesses and questions to which she could not find answers. Finally, the noblewoman gathered her strength and, smiling slightly, greeted her relative, apologizing for the delay, explaining that she was delayed due to many urgent matters that required her attention in the last hours. Uncle, unable to contain his excitement, began to shout furiously about how destructive the circumstances were, because Gustaf had returned early from completing his school days, which could ruin all the carefully laid plans they had prepared. The noblewoman, holding her breath, sat down in the chair next to him, and shaking her head slightly, admitted that she was shocked by this event. But perhaps it was actually for the best, because the return of her brother could change a lot. Her uncle, noticing her confidence, indignantly objected, reminding her that Gustaf had not simply returned, but was threatening to take her place as the head of the family, and this caused him deep concern because such actions could overshadow all their efforts. Without the slightest worry, the noblewoman calmly replied that according to the terms of their contract, Gustaf would become a lord in 2 years. So it was inevitable, and despite all her fears, she believed that he would have to fulfill his role in the future. However, when her uncle said that with such words, her situation would become even more vulnerable and she would not be safe, the girl froze, feeling a chill run through her, because these words called into question everything she believed in. The uncle said with cold disdain that when the man finally became the head of the family, he would immediately get rid of his useless sister, throw her away like useless trash, leaving no trace because she had no value to him. The nobleman, seeing that his words had affected his niece, began to sow doubts in her soul, reminding her that even her mother had once been given medicine by the Duke, but that it had not brought any benefit, and on the contrary, the situation had only gotten worse each time. Romeo, hearing these words, was exhausted, because it was a complete surprise for her. She did not know about such circumstances, and felt how doubts and fear began to cover her heart, forcing her to think about what was really happening. The uncle mockingly waved his hand towards the girl, reminding her that only he truly cared about her as his own niece, that he was always there, unlike others, and only he was ready to offer her his support in this difficult moment. The noblewoman expressed gratitude to the man for his advice, but despite the politeness, the decision about whose side she should be on depended entirely on her, and only she could determine which path would be correct. The uncle sat absorbed in his own disappointment, his silence complete, and his face full of worry. He had failed to convince his relative that he alone genuinely cared for her, and had failed to make her part of his sinister plan. When the noblewoman finally left the room, Romeo, overcome with fatigue, sank onto the sofa, feeling the tension leave her body, and the conversation that left her with no strength took away her last energy. At that moment, Romeo's attention was drawn to a young man with a tray on which was served a cool drink, refreshing and invigorating. Cold iced tea, which gave a feeling of lightness and coolness like the morning breeze. The girl instantly stood up, ready to do anything to get this long-awaited drink. Her face lit up with a smile, and her eyes filled with tears of happiness, because this moment gave her an incredible feeling of joy and peace. It was Gustaf who had come to visit to please his sister and offer her a cup of tea, hoping to bring a little warmth into her day and share with her this moment of simple but precious pleasure, creating an atmosphere of coziness and closeness. The noblewoman did not hesitate and immediately began to drink the gift that was presented to her, enjoying every sip. For her sweetness was a real luxury, especially in this world where even sugar was so expensive that only aristocrats could afford it. The glass was placed on the table with a quiet ringing sound, and the ice that remained in the glass continued to ring, as if reminding us how fleeting and fragile such moments of happiness are contained in simple but priceless pleasures. The young man looked at his sister with concern and warned her that she had drunk the drink too hastily, reminding her that if it really contained poison, the consequences could be tragic and irreversible for her health. Romeo, slightly alarmed by his words, quickly came to her senses, reacting to his threats, with light sarcasm pairing them with a smile, and confidently declaring that such empty threats do not frighten her and cannot scare her. When it became clear that her brother was just playing a joke on her, the aristocrat calmed down with a light sigh, sat down on the sofa, enjoying the moment of peace that returned to her with a feeling of inner harmony. Gustaf, however, stood silently in place, his gaze fixed intently on Romeo, not taking his eyes off her face, as if he wanted to say something, but internally restrained himself, not daring to be frank. Taking heart, he finally broke the heavy silence by asking her if she believed him, as if it was the only question he could ask at that moment. It was a question that tormented his soul, giving him no peace, and every word was filled with deep anxiety. Having received her consent, Gustaf, collecting his thoughts, asked Romaya why she thought that he wanted to kill her, not hiding his confusion and anxiety. The girl froze in place, not knowing how to answer this frank question. Her eyes betrayed her confusion. Her fingers clenched tightly into fists, feeling the internal tension like heavy chains binding her body. And then they trembled, as if she was searching for the strength to answer. But all her thoughts and emotions were mixed up, and at that moment, everything seemed too complicated. The man, holding back his disappointment, lowered his head, feeling his heart squeeze in his chest, accepting her silence and indecision as an admission that she did not believe him and did not trust his words, which greatly upset him. The lady, lost in thought, tried to find words to explain to the man that she had experienced a strange and frightening dream in which he, having become the head of the family, was killing her. The sweet noblewoman did not know how to tell him about it without causing misunderstandings. After some thought, the noblewoman decided to be frank. Folding her hands in front of her, she said with restraint that such a thought had indeed visited her, that having taken the place of the head of the family, the young man could order her execution, which of course greatly worried her. Then, feeling the weight of her words, she added that, even if something like this did happen in reality, she was not sure she could do anything to prevent such events, since her power over what was happening was limited. The young man, waiting with restraint for her words, sat silently. A cold atmosphere hung in the air, and an uneasy silence reigned around. The stately man was in no hurry to answer, not trying to assure her that he would not have done such a thing. And then, unexpectedly for everyone, Gustaf stood up from his seat, without taking his eyes off her, and slowly approaching Romeo, asked with interest why exactly she decided that he could ever decide on such an act, to end her life without listening to her explanation. Putting his hand on the lady's throat, the young man, with a determined expression on his face, declared that he did not like the fact that such thoughts could even come into the noblewoman's head, because they did not correspond at all to reality and his relationship with her. Sweet Romeo, frowning in surprise, asked in bewilderment if her brother didn't hate her, since he was always reserved and cold in his communication with her, without showing the slightest sign of affection or care. Finally, the man removed his hand from the lady's throat, and looking into her eyes, honestly answered that he himself did not fully understand what feelings he had for Romeo, and could not say exactly what connected him with her at that moment. The aristocrat returned to his chair, throwing his head back, with a light sigh, immersed in deep thoughts about what was happening around him. He tried to comprehend how all this could have happened, and to build for himself a clear understanding of what he should do next. The lady, unexpectedly for herself, laughed, realizing the absurdity of the situation, and then, slightly embarrassed, admitted that she still felt a little remorse, realizing that she was not quite correctly perceiving what was happening. The young man thought about it, and realizing that his mother and stepmother had often treated him unfairly in his childhood, sometimes beating him and accusing him of things he had not done, he still understood that Romeo should not pay for the mistakes of her parents. The lovely lady, folding her hands in front of her, began to play with her fingers, as if trying to calm down and collect her thoughts in order to regain control of the situation and figure out how to proceed in this difficult conversation. Romeo, a wide smile stretching her face with a sincere expression on her lips, turned to her brother, asking him to at least believe in her a little, because she, according to her, had already earned at least a drop of trust from him. Turning away and completely relaxing on the couch, she added that she would be happy if Gustaf ever became the head, but not through her death, which would be much better than such a scenario which they both did not deserve. The sweet aristocrat, tilting her head in surprise, could not hide her shock when she heard the young man say that he could not understand her at all because she never thought that he would be able to understand her in such a way. A silence hung between the young couple, which neither of them dared to break, as if both were waiting to see who would be the first to make a move and break out of this tense moment that had more questions than answers. Their uncle had too much information and often used his position to remind the young duke's stepmother of her debts, which became a heavy burden for everyone who dealt with him. The two of them were talking, discussing what kind of spy the nobleman could send into their house to spy on them and report back to his master, for nothing could be more important to them than exposing this dangerous conspiracy. Romeo stood up from her seat, stating firmly that they needed to find those who had betrayed them as soon as possible and get rid of them, removing them from their jobs to eliminate the threat and prevent any further problems for their safety. The sweet young man agreed that the spy's aim was most likely blackmail, and therefore they should seek them out through provocations, since only in this way could they reveal the true intentions of these hidden enemies. Those people were like fleas attached to a cat's fur, constantly buzzing and disturbing their peace, not allowing them the slightest rest, and their whole purpose was to parasitize on what they considered their opportunity. Romaya laughed at the comparison, happily enjoying the fact that her brother was on her side, understanding her point of view, and sharing her opinion, which gave her confidence that together they could overcome any difficulties. The nobleman, angrily slamming the table, did not hide his disappointment, reacting furiously to the fact that his niece dared to object to him, which only irritated him even more and made him feel humiliated. The man was angry as hell, his body was shaking with rage, and every word he spoke was filled with anger and malice, as if he was ready to tear everything around him in search of a way out of his rage. The aristocrat, filled with hatred, angrily threw the table over, hoping that his niece would show reason and not dare to contradict him. But to his great disappointment, she acted completely differently from what he expected, not giving in to his pressure. In high society, the nobleman managed to collect many looks full of disappointment, which only increased his irritation because he counted on support and respect, but instead faced hostility. The man was about to become the owner of a huge estate and head of the family after his niece, but suddenly his carefully constructed plans collapsed, and everything he aspired to now seemed irretrievably lost. The uncle, hanging his head in despair, thought in confusion about his relative, who despite all her mistakes remained a mystery to him, and he could not understand how she so easily avoided all troubles. Somehow, she managed to withstand the weight of the hereditary ring without consuming her in its fire. And despite everything, she remained an integral part of their family, which only increased his pain and bewilderment at her strange and incomprehensible fate. The noble aristocrat, not hiding his frustration, called the maid and ordered her to immediately call his son, because he hoped that he would be able to somehow help resolve the situation and return everything to its place. When the young man came down, his father put his hand on the boy's shoulder, and with a look full of concern said that he should have gotten married a long time ago because he had an excellent candidate for this role, ready to become part of their family. When Romeo, dressed in a new red dress, hugged herself, Gustaf noticed this, and with gentle interest asked if she was cold in the room, because his attention was drawn to her behavior, which he could not help but notice. The knight, who was lighting a fire in the fireplace, calmly noted that it was the middle of summer, and although the night temperatures might be cool, it was quite normal for that time of year, as the summer heat had not yet arrived. The noblewoman awkwardly admitted that she was currently wearing too many layers of clothing, but despite this, she did not feel warm enough, which only increased her discomfort in the cold room filled with an icy atmosphere. Gustaf, raising his head upon hearing her words, suggested that they should definitely find a master mage who could create such things that could give warmth, as it would be the perfect solution to their cold problem. Romeo clapped her hands happily and enthusiastically agreed with her brother, adding that they should also set up trade and allow the people in their lands to buy such things at an affordable price to make life easier for the common people. The brother, holding the documents tightly in his hands, nodded in agreement with his sister, realizing that she was absolutely right. He decided that there was no point in wasting time, and they would soon begin searching for a wizard who could help them deal with this problem. Suddenly, the girl remembered that the first shipment of goods to the Golden Rose organization would take place next week, and she would have to organize all the necessary preparatory steps before that time, so that the transaction would be successful and expectations would be met. The documents he held in his hands contained details of the crystal shipments, and there were so many of them that it clearly indicated the significance of the deal, opening up new horizons for their duchy and providing great prospects for further development. The lady, laughing awkwardly, remembered that it was not for nothing that foreign magicians were forbidden to enter their duchy and explore the cold caves, because such actions could lead to unpredictable consequences. The Association of Mages rose to their feet and began to protest furiously when the elf showed them the crystals she had received, as a result of the deal, suspecting that they might not be as safe as they seemed at first glance. She then told them about the mana stone, which shone with such brightness that its value was obvious to everyone, and according to her, its value represented a fortune which only added fuel to the fire, increasing discontent among the magicians. Because the wizards were not interested in power or money, it became necessary to send them a sample of the crystal in order to win their favor and hope for possible cooperation in the future. Holding a cup of hot tea with both hands, the maiden looked thoughtfully at the steam rising from the drink and thought to herself how difficult it was to establish connections with the mages without having access to their secrets. The noblewoman tilted her head slightly to the side, barely audibly muttering under her breath that it would be a real blessing if Gustaf were next to her, ready to help complete such an important and responsible delivery of the mana stones. The long-awaited season of aristocracy will soon arrive when all the highest nobility, not holding back their ambitions, will flock to the capital to organize lavish and luxurious events, immersing themselves in empty talk and social affairs, which nevertheless set the rhythm of life in the city. At balls, they dance with grace, captivating the eyes of all those present. They engage in endless conversations discussing trifles and flaunting their importance, despite the fact that in reality their lives are consumed by empty entertainment and meaningless affairs. The city was full of various interesting places, from luxury boutiques, where you could find anything you wanted to, bustling streets, where carriages moved majestically, creating a lively atmosphere. To be accepted at aristocratic balls, a noblewoman had to come of age at 19 and go through a special ceremony that confirmed her status and right to participate in high social events. Romeo decided to act cunningly, demonstrating that she not only possesses rare magic crystals, but also created amazing items from them, tools, lanterns, and other wonders that no one had seen before, bringing in elements of the modern world. Previously, the most luxurious ball was held in the imperial palace, where the castle itself was called the Golden Swan, striking guests with its majestic beauty and splendor, setting the standard for all future social events. It would be wonderful, however, if the imperial mansion itself became the first client interested in purchasing the precious stones and rare objects that she so carefully prepared for sale. The noblewoman frowned, folding her hands in front of her, her gaze dimmed, absorbed in thoughts of business deals and upcoming events of the novel, which, as it seemed to her, could radically change her future, like an invisible thread pulling her to the unknown. She thought about Rumi, the second protagonist of the novel, whose fate was full of suffering, and every day he became more and more vulnerable. The woman's heart was filled with melancholy because she sincerely wanted to find a way to save him from all the troubles that haunted him. Gustaf, who was watching the noblewoman out of the corner of his eye, noticed that her face reflected anxiety and concern flashed in his gaze. He realized that her inner state could not remain unnoticed, and this concern did not give him peace. The lady's head snapped up as she heard her brother calling her name, and at that moment she realized that she again didn't understand what exactly he was talking about, causing her to confuse her words and respond in confusion. When the aristocrat suggested that they go and rest a little, Romeo, despite her worries and fatigue, replied with a smile that everything was fine and that she felt quite normal, assuring that her condition did not cause any cause for concern. The maid gracefully approached the table with freshly brewed tea, and as she began to carefully pour it into the cup, a warm stream filled the air with an aroma that was so pleasant that it created a feeling of coziness and relaxation. Much time passed, and when all the affairs were settled, Romeo finally decided to rest. The maiden went to the bathroom, plunged into the warm water, sat on the side, and taking a deep breath, felt how all her tense muscles relaxed. The beauty enjoyed the silence and solitude in the bathroom for a long time, absorbed in the calm, but soon realized that if she didn't get out, she risked falling asleep right in the water, which of course would be extremely uncomfortable and unsafe for her. When the maid brought her the new medicine, Romaya looked curiously at the bowl, containing a strange dark-colored liquid, with an unpleasant smell, immediately feeling some displeasure at such a surprise. Suddenly, the cup of medicine slipped from her hands and fell to the floor with a dull sound. The lady took one sip and immediately felt herself overcome by drowsiness, and her health deteriorated sharply as if the strength had left her body. Romeo, losing consciousness, collapsed helplessly onto the hard floor, never reaching the bed, and instantly sank into a deep, peaceful sleep, as if her body had decided to escape from reality into this world of oblivion. In her dream, Istalif, the spirit of the blue stone, appeared smiling at her with a mysterious smile. His long hair, like a flame of blue fire, hung down and shimmered, and in his large eyes one could see a deep sky full of snow. The lady, in shock, looked at the spirit, which was half human, but its lower body had the shape of a mysterious animal, either a horse or a deer, which amazed her imagination. The spirit continued to smile, pressing his hand to his face, and curiously asked how the noblewoman knew his name, and how she was able to tame him, causing both fear and surprise in her soul. With pain in her soul, the beauty lowered her gaze, feeling a wave of bitterness wash over her, thinking about her death, and who could have been her killer. Perhaps it was Gustaf, but she could not believe it. When Romeo finally opened her eyes, the girl was overcome with horror. Right in front of her face hovered the spirit of blue flame. His bright gaze met her eyes, and this meeting made her heart squeeze with fear and anxiety. The creature let out a strange, sinister laugh, which made the beauty involuntarily freeze. At that moment, its neck suddenly lengthened, as if under the influence of an unknown force, and a monstrous deformation made its body swing from side to side. The noblewoman was seized with horror. Her body did not obey, and trembling passed through her with such force that even breathing became difficult. The lady could not understand what was happening, and her whole being was filled with panic fear. With his arms folded across his chest, the spirit answered his companion's question, confirming that she had not died, but was merely alive, despite all the strange circumstances that were happening around her. The noblewoman froze in place like a stone statue, realizing that in fact, she had not died, but had only lost consciousness, plunging into a dark state, but remained alive despite everything happening around her. The creature approaching the aristocrat with unnatural speed, again, with a cold, almost sinister grin on its face, said her name, causing her heart to clench in surprise, because she had no idea how it could know her identity. The lady frowned, her face darkened with anger and bewilderment, and a determined intent flashed in her eyes. She refused to answer the question, deciding that silence and ignoring this strange creature would be her best and only correct choice. But then her attention was drawn to another man, a snake man with snow-white skin, whose eyes were black, and whose hair was also dark, and ancient patterns spread across his entire body like darkness woven into his flesh. The man was known as the Black Spear, and while many considered him an embodiment of fear and dark power, he and his ally, the Blue Flame Spirit, had no intention of frightening the maiden. Their only interest was in learning more about her. The Black Spear was not just a person, but a spirit that was connected to another ducal family and protected them from adversity, being the one who stood guard over the peace and stability of the other kingdom. While the spirits continued their conversation, Romeo, finally gathering all her courage, decided to ask a question. If she told them the whole truth, would they let her go from this world into which she had ended up completely by accident? The creatures, enchanted by her words, listened attentively to the revelation, and with each of her words, it became clearer that they were all actually inside a novel, like pages in a book, written by someone's hand. The girl began to explain that she herself had accidentally ended up inside their book, without understanding how it had happened, and now she had absolutely no idea how to get out of this confusing and strange world into which she had been mysteriously carried away. Suddenly, out of nowhere, another strange creature appeared, with the wings of an angel, the body of a man, and the head of a leopard. The creature said that this time a very unusual traveler from another world had come to them, not like those who had come here before. The leopard chuckled loudly. looking favorably at the traveler from another world. The man was used to others looking at him strangely because his unusual appearance always caused surprise and confusion. Romea, shocked by the sudden encounter with this deity, whose appearance combined the head of an animal with the body of a human, felt her world crumble. She felt alien, as if she had found herself in a world where every rule and concept was far from her usual reality. The creature spread its huge angelic wings, and flapping them, it dispersed the thick fog that enveloped the space around, as if revealing to them invisible horizons and hidden mysteries of this world. After this, God created a chair for the lady, placing it next to the table, and invited her to sit down since their conversation promised to be long, important, and full of deep thoughts, which could continue for a long time. It turned out that there was a caste system among the spirits, where some were higher and others were lower, and this hierarchy had its own characteristics that influenced the behavior and interaction of each of them. And so, looking at the leopard in front of her, the noblewoman clearly felt that this creature without a doubt occupied the highest level among other spirits, as if it stood on the highest peak immeasurably higher than all the others. Lowering his head down, the deity carefully studied what and how much was written by the lady's hand about them, about her perception, and how she saw this novel, which could be part of their mutual experiences and destinies. The creature, hearing the words of its interlocutor, pressed its hand to its chin and declared that this world, although it seemed outside of reality, was not created by it, but only by an earthly entity incapable of fully understanding its depth and true nature. The noblewoman laughed it off when she was called a simple seer, rather than the creator of the world, smiling as she noted that her abilities certainly went beyond ordinary perception, and she had the right to look at it with a little irony. A whole bunch of questions immediately arose in the beauty's head. If this was so, then it turned out that Gustaf might not be the main character, and her role in this plot could be much less significant than she had previously thought. The girl realized, standing up, that this world had already been created, and she had simply seen it in a dream, rewriting it into the book of her modern world as a kind of memory that had now become part of her reality and her personal history. Frowning, Romea shouted loudly that she had previously been absolutely certain that she had made up this reality herself, and now she had to come to terms with the fact that she had merely witnessed something much greater. It was the first and last time the girl wrote something herself. Many did this as children, creating their own worlds and stories, but now it seemed to her that her creative independence only undermined her own perception. The noblewoman hung her head in disappointment. She had previously thought that she was a genius, but now faced with reality, she felt her confidence crumbling, and everything that seemed obvious to her took on a new, frightening unknown. The aristocrat looked away, admitting to herself that she also bore the name of the heroine, whose body she now occupied, and that she had once died in an accident in her world, leaving everything behind to be transported to this new existence. Extending his hand forward, the deity pronounced the verdict that she found herself in an unusual situation that was full of hidden meanings and possibilities, but this still did not cancel out the fact that her path would be difficult and full of trials. The leopard, smiling contentedly, satisfied the interest of his friend, the blue flame, and the naga, revealing to him the secrets of his world, and it seemed even playing along with his curiosity a little, as if it were part of their difficult game. Suddenly, the noblewoman fell onto the bed, clutching her head, her mind filled with chaos. All this seemed like a strange dream, a foggy reality that could not be real, because her world had always been so logical and stable. In front of her appeared a ceiling richly decorated with crystal chandeliers that reflected the light, creating many highlights, and the setting itself looked luxurious and elegant, as if she were in a palace full of mysteries and secrets. Rushing to the mirror, Romea smiled with relief when she saw her reflection, as she had already begun to worry that she might be transferred into someone else's body, and the thought that she might end up in a completely new guise scared her to the core. But the lady could not understand whose room she had accidentally wandered into, despite the expensive and exquisite interior details decorated with magnificent objects, each of which, regardless of its value, filled her with the spirit of true wealth and splendor. There, inside, on the luxurious cushions and tables, lay jewelry, crowns, necklaces, earrings, the glitter of which illuminated the room, giving it an atmosphere of high society, and their exquisite design made Romaya feel even more out of place among this splendor. Finally realizing that this was the Duke's wife's room, the lady breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that her presence here would probably not lead to dire consequences, and perhaps the situation would somehow resolve itself if she was patient. At that moment, a young maid entered the room with a kind and joyful smile on her face, and happily announced that the mistress had finally woken up, radiating such sincere joy that Romeo immediately felt relief and a little surprise. Turning to the mistress, the servant asked with concern how she was feeling, clearly showing sincere concern, because her attention was directed to the well-being of the lady, who despite the alarming events, remained an important person in her eyes. Romeo, with a slight smile and a confident tone, replied that she was all right, as she felt better than she expected, and upon hearing her words, the maid, clearly surprised, muttered that they should have immediately informed her brother's master of the awakening. Gustaf sat in the living room, dressed in black, with a look of complete concentration on his face, his arms folded across his chest, waiting patiently for his sister to finally wake up every moment, causing his heart to beat with anxiety and impatience. The noblewoman thoughtfully ran her hand over a small mirror with an elegant handle that lay on the table. Her gaze was focused on this object as if it could reveal secrets, and she could not believe that that strange dream was really reality. Surprised, the lady opened her eyes wide in shock, trying to comprehend the strangeness of what was happening, but it was difficult for her to accept that she found herself in a world that perhaps was not created by her at all. Slamming her fist into her other palm, the noblewoman realized that she was not to blame for the creation of this world, because this world already existed before she entered it, and her role in it was not as decisive as she had previously thought. Pleased with herself, the beauty laughed, realizing that despite all the difficulties, she was able to not only protect her brother, but also gain confidence that her strength and wisdom could well cope with this unusual world. The freckled maid was genuinely happy for her mistress's happiness, her eyes shining from the fact that she could be a part of such an important moment in the lady's life, sharing with her this moment of joy and relief. Romeo turned to the servant with interest, asking her name as she had not seen this girl in this house before, which caused her slight surprise, but perhaps also a desire to learn more about the new faces appearing around. The maid replied with a smile that others might call her Miss Kara, because she was new here and had only recently started working in this house, which was a new and significant stage in her life, but she was ready to cope with any difficulties. Soon dinner was served, consisting of a fragrant soup and a fresh salad with vegetables served on a large tray, and everything looked so appetizing that every bite of food promised to bring real pleasure. Gustaf, who was standing nearby, explained that he was very worried about the aristocrat because she had frightened everyone by fainting, and his anxiety did not leave him until it was clear that she was okay and her life was safe. Romeo, as if nothing had happened, took the plate of food and calmly said that she was glad that it was not her brother who tried to poison her. Her words were full of lightness and even mockery, but her calmness was unexpected for everyone. Gustaf, taking a cup of tea in his hands, was offended because he was not so stupid as to poison his sister. He would have chosen another option if it was necessary, but in fact his concern was sincere and he was worried about her condition. The girl, however, despite the fact that she had taken a sleeping pill, still had a good appetite, and the desire to eat seemed so natural that it contrasted with the efforts she had to make to recover from everything that had happened. Last night, when the lady fell on the floor after taking the medicine, the maid was very frightened. Her heart began to beat with anxiety, and without thinking, she ran for help, hoping that her actions could prevent something terrible. But in fact, the maid did not go to medical help, but to a man who, smiling, offered her not only help, but also freedom from debt if she agreed to poison the head of the Duke's family, which was a shocking and dangerous deal. The young man, placing his hands on the girl's shoulders, promised with a gentle intonation that he would never condemn her act, even if she had to become an accomplice in such a terrible deed. And moreover, he promised that she would receive a reward by becoming an important figure. Having run away, the maid suddenly ran into a gentleman named Gustaf, who resolutely, pressing his finger to his lips, gestured for silence. Her heart began to pound from the suddenness of the meeting, and filled with anxiety, she froze, waiting for what he would say in response to her action. The man quietly said that if the maid behaved quietly and did not attract unnecessary attention, then perhaps she would remain alive, and her fate, like her life, depended on her further actions. Passing the master's servant, Gustaf calmly walked further down the corridor, leaving the traitor with the knight, as if his actions were only part of some more complex and confusing game in which she found herself drawn. The girl, unable to cope with the storm of emotions, suddenly collapsed on the floor, her body trembling with fear, and her mind could not understand what awaited her in the future, and her thoughts rushed about in panic when the horror for her life swallowed her up completely, leaving not the slightest chance for peace. At this time, Romeo was lying on the floor, unconscious, her eyes closed and her hair scattered in different directions, as if she was part of some nightmare vision in which her body was just a lifeless figure, lost touch with reality. The vile man who had decided to poison the beauty sat next to her, smiling and enjoying the thought of how strong the new poison he had chosen, was confident that his plan would work without fail. However, when the boy tried to touch the lady with his hand, he was stopped by a sword that appeared out of nowhere, and a strange but confident voice that greeted his brother, as if knowing more about his intentions than the man himself. The sweat covering the young man's face could not hide his confusion. He tried to justify himself to his relative, trying to explain that apparently there had been a misunderstanding, and that everything was not at all as it might seem at first glance. Holding the blade to the boy, Gustaf rudely interrupted him, stating that his actions were clearly evil. The boy tried to take their sister's clothes off and also drugged her to carry out his dirty intentions. The boy's fingers tightened in rage around the hilt of his blade. His face expressed complete contempt for this betrayal, and every nerve in his body tensed ready for immediate action if the situation could not be resolved with words. The girl who was sleeping innocently would have been completely horrified if her face had been covered in blood. Her long eyelashes and blonde hair looked fragile and defenseless, and the thoughts of violence against her filled Gustaf's heart with anger and determination. The young man was the rightful heir and owner of his home, a young master who owned everything he saw around him, and his responsibility for his family and honor left him little room for compromise, especially when it came to protecting his sister. He was disgusted by the idea that his sister had been used against him, trying to take away his power money and estate, playing on his weakness and sense of responsibility. This realization filled him with rage, and he could not allow it to go unpunished. Without thinking twice, Gustaf struck the scoundrel, who dared to insult his sister, causing him to fall with a cry of pain, his body barely able to withstand such a sharp blow. And he ended up on the floor, helplessly curled up. The guy, having hit his head on the floor, found himself in such a state that his eyes were filled with a cloudy look, and his consciousness was clouded, unable to perceive reality. The blow was so strong. Gustaf stepped on his fallen opponent and rudely stated that it was probably time for them to have a serious talk, and his voice was full of menace, as if he no longer saw the point in further words. Everything was clear, and now only actions mattered. The aristocrat froze in horror upon hearing the truth of last night's events. Her face was swallowed by a shadow, as if the darkness was forever clouding her mind, preventing her from finding a single word to respond, and her thoughts were stuck in chaos. Gustaf continued to drink his tea calmly, without showing the slightest emotion. His face remained as impenetrable as stone. His thoughts and feelings were hidden behind a mask of imperturbability, as if he were a part of this world, not subject to the influence of external circumstances. The lady was in complete shock to learn that her uncle's son had tried to hurt her while she was unconscious, and even the beating of her honor became part of this betrayal, like a knife in the heart, tearing her soul apart and leaving a deep wound. Raising her hand up, she began to reason that there was no need to be surprised by such a vile act on the part of a relative, as if her thoughts were trying to comprehend what was happening. But everything remained so absurd and terrible that it did not give her soul peace. Taking the cup of drink in his hands, the Duke calmly added that in 3 days their uncle was to be interrogated, and all the information that he tried to hide would be revealed, no matter how difficult it would be to get to the truth and what efforts would be required to find it. Gustaf folded his hands in front of him, saying with satisfaction that after the interrogation they had received a lot of important information, and the names of those who could help them in the future, strengthening their positions and revealing secrets. The noblewoman, feeling growing uneasy, hesitantly put her hand to her mouth, because Robbie, despite his high ambition, was not distinguished by an outstanding mind, and the thought that his actions would soon be revealed overwhelmed her with anxiety like a heavy burden. The nobleman chuckled, his face darkened, his eyes burning with determination to punish his opponents for their overconfidence and reckless act against his sister, which violated all boundaries of what was permitted. Having given her name and putting her hand to her face, Romeo plunged into deep thought, trying to understand whether the Baron was really guilty of this story, or whether he was just a pawn in someone else's cunning game, not realizing the full gravity and consequences of his actions. The noblewoman laughed loudly, saying that their uncle was doing something banal, without the slightest imagination, as if all his actions were predictable and lacking depth, which only added to her disappointment. If the Baron is arrested in the near future, it will be incredibly difficult for him and his relative to restore their former relationship, because the consequences of this act can forever change their destinies and tie them to a past that can no longer be returned. However, Romeo also knew that she should stop her brother from killing his uncle, as it would certainly have a negative impact on his reputation and possibly ruin his entire career, causing him to lose the trust of those around him. Looking down, the aristocrat proposed to take away all the territories and property of her relative, exiling him overseas, in order to thus get rid of this dangerous legacy, leaving no trace of his presence. Having received full agreement from her brother that this was indeed a wise decision, the noblewoman smiled with relief, and with that they came to a decision, knowing that this step would ensure their safety and well-being in the future. After this, the lady, after thinking a little, asked her interlocutor whether he had previously known that their uncle was plotting something and had bad intentions, because now, when all the cards were revealed, her long-standing suspicions began to acquire clear confirmation. Gustaf replied that, to be honest, all he could think of was that his sister was too fast and sometimes rushed forward without paying attention to the dangers that might lie in wait for them along the way with her determination and haste. The guy chuckled, folding his arms across his chest, and added that their blood relative had also not hesitated, deciding to take a vile step that could change everything without thinking about the consequences and the victims that could follow. And yet, if Gustaf had been even a moment late, the evil Robbie would have had no hesitation in committing horrible acts with his sister's body, showing no compassion or respect for her life, completely disregarding her dignity. The lady quietly thanked her interlocutor for saving her. Her voice sounded with sincere gratitude, because she realized how close they were to disaster and how important every moment was to avoid disaster. Romeo froze in surprise when she heard that the man had previously thought that she didn't trust him. Her gaze filled with bewilderment, and she, as if not believing her ears, tried to understand what had caused such an assumption. Gustaf, noticing that the lady wanted to say something, gently asked her to continue, assuring her that she could speak frankly and boldly, because in this conversation there was no room for hidden thoughts or unexpressed doubts, but only for truth and revelations. Finally, the man received words from his sister in which she admitted that she had no intention of dying, although while acknowledging her fears, she added that despite this, she was tormented by a horror of possible death, which she could not completely drive away. It turned out that the lady, speaking of her readiness to die at the behest of her brother, meant that she had previously been ready to part with life, but now she decisively took these words back, realizing their great complexity. The beauty, smiling boldly, declared that she was not only ready to take risks and counterattack, but was also determined to confront any threats from other people without giving in or panicking. Gustaf smiled with relief and joy, because he never wanted his close relative to leave this life so easily without the slightest resistance, and always hoped that she would fight to the last. The noblewoman confidently declared that she still did not abandon her carefully constructed plan, which had already begun to be implemented, and now all that remained was to patiently wait for the moment to come when time and circumstances would play their role in its completion. Stubbornly shaking her head, as if not wanting to give in to any of her convictions, the lady continued that in 2 years she would hand over her post as head of the family to her brother, and he would take over the leadership of the family, confident in the impeccability of the decision and its consequences. However, what exactly would happen to her? Romia had no idea and did not even try to think about it, preferring to live here and now, following her principles, and not worrying about what might await her in the future. Gustaf listened carefully when the lady finally proposed an alliance between them, realizing that behind those words lay something deeper and more significant than just a political agreement that could affect their destinies. The nobleman closed his eyes deep in thought and realized that in that case, she would be the only person capable of betraying him, which gave the idea both a threat and an extraordinary importance. The lady, without hiding her determination, sought in her words the most important trust, as if hinting that he would have to trust her to such an extent that it could become a test where there was no room for weakness or hesitation. After much deliberation, Gustaf finally agreed to the proposed union, and the two sat side by side in armchairs, immersed in a silence in which hung the realization that this step would open a new chapter in their mutual relationship and determine their future destiny. As the conversation moved on to more serious matters, Romea suddenly announced that she urgently needed pocket money, emphasizing her urgent need, which seemed to require an immediate solution and attention from him. The future duke, with indifference and clarity, replied that she could use any funds from their family treasury without attaching much importance to the request, considering it a minor matter that should not affect their more important affairs. Frustrated, Romea suddenly remembered that their balance was currently zero, and they were desperately short of money, which increased her anxiety about how she would be able to implement her plans and cope with the uncertainty of the future. Gustaf could not argue with her words, but nevertheless emphasized that, as soon as they had the coins at their disposal, she would be free to take as much as she needed without limiting herself. The lady, not agreeing with his proposal, insisted that she wanted her own money, which would be intended exclusively for her, and not for her role as the head of their family, where every step would be under control. When the long-awaited union was finally concluded, the young man rose from his seat and, slowly approaching the lady, gently ran his hand over her cheek. This gesture caused her a feeling of surprise and confusion, as if the world had frozen for a moment. In complete shock, Romeo realized that by saying those words, it was as if he had performed a miracle. Everything that had happened before disappeared in an instant, leaving behind only a weightless feeling of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Looking only at his sister, the man noticed how all traces of fatigue that once darkened her face disappeared, as if the invisible force that weighed on her had dissolved into thin air, leaving her unusually light and calm. After this, Gustaf left the room without a word, leaving the lady alone and being in complete solitude. Romea, taking the teapot, began to pour herself some tea, as if trying to put her thoughts in order and drive away her worries. After pouring herself a cup of the aromatic drink, Romea came to the conclusion that it was unlikely that her brother could hate her, especially after he showed his concern by bringing a tray of food, which was perhaps his way of showing support. Without thinking about anything else, the lady drank the hot drink in one gulp, hoping to quench her inner anxiety, and for a moment she was able to forget about all the questions and doubts that had been tormenting her soul all this time, as if the drink had brought her a short respite. However, everything turned out to be much simpler than she expected. And now, finally, the villains and her offenders, who had become enemies, realized that their attempts to harm her would not go unpunished, which filled her soul with determination. Virgo still couldn't believe that Robbie, a man she once considered close, could want to show violence because of his uncontrollable love for her, which caused her mixed feelings, from surprise to disgust. Deciding that the bad guys needed to be punished, they came to a unanimous decision, and Ramaya couldn't help but laugh, saying that now, thanks to this, she could calmly become a cruel woman without feeling any regrets. The knife easily cut the meat, and the future duke declared with determination that he would punish the scoundrels himself, lowering their status, so that they would feel the full weight of their actions and understand that no one would go unpunished. Moreover, he added that after this, he would send them into distant exile, depriving them of any means and opportunity to return, which was supposed to be a truly harsh lesson for them. The lady, hearing her brother's words, froze at the table, not knowing how to react correctly. After eating, the noblewoman remained alone in her office, absorbed in a multitude of papers, carefully studying them. She was immersed in serious thoughts that did not let her go, causing internal tension and a feeling of responsibility for the decisions made. They were in their big white house, and now it seemed that none of their relatives could interfere with the decisions they had made, and were now carrying out condemning all their enemies to loneliness and isolation. Looking into the distance, the beauty wearily thought that they needed to pay off the remaining debts to other families as soon as possible and close all financial issues so as not to think anymore about the financial problems that weighed so heavily on her soul. Only after this will Gustaf be able to strengthen his power by inheritance, meet the main character, who until now remained an unsolved mystery, and make her his wife, thereby ensuring the future of their family. The room was filled with talk of luxurious decorations. A chandelier hung from the ceiling. Expensive items were placed on the table, and the windows overlooking the beautiful view filled the atmosphere with a sense of wealth and impeccable taste. Romeo explained to her brother that by selling the jewelry, they would be able to pay off the debts they had and thus get rid of their financial obligations to the officials, leaving them in the past. As the lady signed new documents and contracts, she soon discovered that a significant portion of their funds had been occupied by government officials, and it became clear to her that they needed to be dealt with as soon as possible to avoid further problems. Frustrated, she hung her head and sighed quietly, realizing that they would be paying the interest on these debts alone for a whole year, which added even more anxiety and irritation to an already difficult situation. One of the books she opened described their family line as being stained with blood full of debts, criminal activity by government officials, and dishonest dealings that blighted their history. As the head of the family, Gustaf had to take on all the weight of responsibility that he could not help but face, and now he had to deal with this mess himself, which became a real test for him. The boy turned sharply as his sister said his name, catching his attention, and her words hung in the air like a bolt of lightning, filling the room with a sense of inevitability, tension, and something completely unexpected that lingered in the air like a foreshadowing. She suddenly admitted that if he had not been around, she would have stolen all the jewelry long ago and run away from this boring and stuffy environment, leaving everything behind, not caring about the consequences or what would happen next. The knight standing next to the master respectfully handed him a cup of tea, hoping that it would bring at least some peace and allow him to relax despite the high level of tension that was felt in the air. The second cup was served to the lady, and the tea almost spilled as the cups landed on the table with a soft clink filling the air with aroma, like a veil of comfort, creating an atmosphere of warmth and calm despite the noisy conversations around. With a polite nod, the guard showed his loyalty and respect, deeply aware of the importance of this gesture, thereby emphasizing his respect for the master's sister, knowing how much these moments meant in their family. Smiling happily, the lady expressed her gratitude to her relative for his sincere concern by accepting a cup of the aromatic drink, which not only warmed her, but also gave a moment of peace in this tense conversation. The guard himself blushed slightly, feeling internally embarrassed, since such a close relationship as the one between the brother and sister was definitely beyond the scope of his position, leaving him confused. Taking the papers in his hands, Gustaf began a long conversation, trying to understand whether Romeo was really ready to take the deceased's things and jewelry to sell them, which seemed to him a strange and slightly cruel act. Without thinking twice, the noblewoman looked around confidently, emphasizing that for her the jewelry had absolutely no meaning, because they were just soulless objects incapable of touching her inner world and changing her feelings. Gustaf realized in complete shock what she probably meant when she said that her future wife might need the jewelry, and this opened up a completely new, unexpected side of her thoughts and intentions for him. Instead of rejoicing, disappointment and deep sadness were reflected on the young man's face when the conversation turned to his future bride, and he realized how difficult it was for him to accept this inevitable reality into which he was so persistently drawn. Time flew by, and autumn arrived, filling the air with a crisp chill, and the leaves of the trees turning bright splashes of orange and gold, creating an atmosphere of change that already felt like winter was coming. Beautiful jewelry crowns and necklaces were sold for very high prices, which allowed significant savings. But behind these items were hidden not only material values, but also dark, sometimes unsightly motives. The lady, pleased with her success, slowly and surely began to pay off her debts to officials, which allowed her step by step to gain the long-awaited independence that she had been striving for such a long time. Rumors began to spread among the servants more and more often, and it was said that, having become the head of the family, Romeo sold all of her late mother's jewelry, and her decision affected the deterioration of the financial situation of the entire family. The servants, as always, could not resist the temptation to discuss what was happening behind their mistress's back, quietly whispering and spreading rumors that only added fuel to the fire of existing tensions. Irritated by these endless rumors, the noblewoman, in a fit of emotion, grabbed her head, unable to understand how such conversations could have arisen at all, and how people, not knowing all the circumstances, so shamelessly discussed her personal affairs and decisions. There was a cup of coffee on the table, and papers, books, and other things were scattered nearby, indicating the intense work and restless thoughts that occupied the lady's mind at that moment. Waving her hand in a sign of concern, the lady turned to her interlocutor with a question about what she should do now that rumors began to circulate that their family was on the verge of bankruptcy and their financial situation was completely unstable. Calmly continuing to read the papers, Gustaf replied that perhaps it was even for the best, since the rumors, although alarming, had no real basis, and they should not worry them in the current situation. The girl was about to ask a question, to find out what exactly the young man meant, when suddenly, like a lightning strike, a realization flashed through her mind, and she instantly understood what was being discussed, feeling how all the pieces of the puzzle came together to form a single picture. Clapping her hands together in joy in front of her, Romeo realized that this way they would be able to expose the spies hiding among their servants, and perhaps even expose those who carefully concealed their true intentions. The man nodded in agreement, and further added that the rumors would cease to exist once others learned of their great nobility and the victories they had won in the harsh, snowy mountains where many had lost hope. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and the person standing behind them announced that a master magician had arrived to visit them, which instantly caught the attention of the young lady, causing her to become alert and focus on what was happening. A low-level mage, France was her name. She was a thin, modest lady whose presence immediately betrayed her caution, and behind her, like a shadow, stood a boy who had barely reached the age of a child, his invisible gaze full of questioning thoughts. Romeo responded to the greetings with courtesy and respect, thanking them and wishing that they too would be blessed by the fiery spirit of life, whose light would illuminate their path and lead them to new discoveries and victories on their life's journey. In response to the noblewoman's attentive gaze, the woman briefly replied that the boy standing next to her was not her child, leaving a certain mystery in these words, as if hiding the real truth behind a simple phrase, not wanting to reveal unnecessary details. Calmly and with restraint, the lady listened to the demand that the young noblewoman presented to her and accepted it with complete discretion, promising that she would not divulge the information that she was about to receive, even if it was not easy. The boy standing next to the lady, quietly but confidently, promised that he would keep everything a strict secret, as if this moment had been predetermined in advance, and his words sounded as if he had already made this decision a long time ago. Hearing these words, Romeo couldn't help but let the smile slowly appear on her face, reflecting a slight satisfaction with what was happening, and the realization that she might have just won an important game. She then snapped her fingers loudly, drawing the attention of everyone present clearly, and without hesitation regaining control of the situation, as if she knew that her next move would be decisive. The maid, with a serious and unyielding expression on her face, brought out the object carefully hidden under the cloth that wrapped around it, leaving everyone in tense anticipation, without revealing what exactly was hidden behind this mysterious covering. Soon the cloth was removed, and underneath it was a mana crystal, bright and shining its light, illuminating everything around, as if it were a source of magical energy, attracting the gaze and attention of everyone nearby. The sorceress, in shock, blushed with surprise and delight, not believing her eyes, since the crystal was so rare and valuable that even she, an experienced sorceress, could not believe in its existence. The crystal was beautifully displayed, and its glow was flawless, pure and clear, as if it had been forged from light itself radiating an aura of magic and majesty that left no one present indifferent. The sorceress even had to squint from the brightness of the precious stone so rare and shining that its light was blinding, causing surprise and admiration in her eyes, as if she had just seen something completely incredible. The noblewoman smiled deeply, understanding, noting that with such a stone, it would be possible to conduct a lot of research and create unimaginable magical entities that opened up endless possibilities for her. The woman could not believe that Romeo had actually entrusted her with such a valuable thing, barely containing her emotions, because it was not just a gift, but a symbol of trust and a special position in their relationship, which turned out to be unexpected and exciting for her. To this, the aristocrat spread her palms and replied with a smile that they had many such crystals. Their value had long since become a common occurrence, accessible to all who understood the true power of these magical stones. Waving her hand in the direction of other gemstones, Romeo added that her goal was to make such crystals available to everyone, regardless of status, turning them from a rarity into something that anyone could use for their own needs. The noblewoman began to tell the woman about how and why these crystals were called ice crystals, how they are mined from deep caves, filled with magical energy, and why it is here in this place that they gain their power and unique properties. Other mages did not dare to approach their tower, considering this occupation beneath their dignity, preferring to work with more pure and familiar artifacts, leaving this unique source of power for those who are able to see its true value. Romaya hit her chest with her palm, said with a slight smile that if she and the woman were equal in this world, then perhaps they should fight together for their goals and ambitions, not hiding it, but on the contrary, strengthening each other. The woman hearing this froze in surprise when she was offered to officially become the main master of their family, the future master of the Duke's magic, which was an unexpected but very honorable offer that could change her fate. After this, she bowed sharply, promising with all determination and devotion to please her mistress with excellent results, doing everything possible to justify the trust and hopes placed in her at this important moment. Quietly placing her hand to her mouth, Romeo said that the witch would first need to create a device that would warm something similar to a modern hot water bottle, a device that could warm in the coldest conditions and still retain its magical essence. The maiden from the world of magic stared at her mistress in bewilderment, trying to understand what exactly she wanted her to create, because the idea was unusual and required not only magical intervention, but also an approach that went beyond the usual. Evening had come, and the snow, like a light veil, was slowly falling from the sky, covering the ground. Autumn was already drawing to an end, and the cold breath of late autumn permeated the air, creating a feeling of approaching winter and inevitable changes. The lady sat in the room, comfortably settled in a soft chair, watching the cold weather through the window. She didn't really want to go out, because the chilly air and gray clouds outside the window only increased the desire to stay inside under the protection of the warmth. She shuddered inside as she thought that very soon the real frosts and snowdrifts would come, closing all the roads and leaving the world covered in an icy blanket, creating a feeling of soulless silence and cold. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and without wasting any time, the maiden allowed the guest to enter, not doubting that her visit carried important news or necessary information that she had long been waiting for despite the surrounding silence. Gustaf walked inside, curious and slightly surprised, asking why his sister hadn't even bothered to ask who had come to see her, as if he expected it to be a more significant event for her than she had let on. Virgo laughingly stated that she had a feeling that he was the one who was supposed to come, and despite the fact that expectations are rarely met, her intuition once again did not fail, giving her a feeling of confidence in what was happening. The lady, rising from her seat, hearing that another guest had come to her, felt a slight intrigue because she became curious about who this stranger was, who made her heart beat faster in anticipation of an unexpected visit. A figure cloaked in a dark cloak entered his face, hidden in the shadows, and the man said that he had heard Romeo waiting for him, with a slight mystery in his voice, as if his appearance had been predicted in advance, like part of a carefully thought-out plan. When the hood was removed, it immediately became clear that the guest was an elf. His long, gracefully pointed ears, like natural ornaments, revealed his unique and ancient origin, reminiscent of mystical forests and magical worlds. He was a handsome man with long, neatly styled hair in tight curls, wearing a green robe that emphasized his grace, and his features were exquisitely regular, as if carved from marble. Romeo, whose braid flowed smoothly and softly over her shoulders, broke into a slight smile, confirming with a refined nod that she had indeed been expecting his visit, and a gleam of confidence flashed in her eyes, as if her intuition had been right once again. She had previously sent him a magical ruby, carefully packaged, and sent through the Golden Rose, an organization that handled cutting-edge magical transactions, trusting only trusted messengers. The elf, with an attentive gaze, although with a slight hint of doubt, could not help but ask about where she got this magical stone from, clearly interested in the source of its power, but holding back from direct suspicion. With a mocking smile, the noblewoman answered his question, asking if she was obliged to respond to such a provocative attack. There was a hidden game in her words, as if she was prepared for any turn of events. After that, she added that she simply wanted to talk to the respected elf gentleman, nothing more, although a plan was already forming in her soul, to conclude a profitable deal with him, secretly hoping for a profitable cooperation. The noblewoman introduced herself by her name softly, saying that her name was Haresh, and waited with restraint, that probably it would be she who would open up new prospects and paths for a profitable partnership for the elf. He twisted the ruby carefully and thoughtfully in his fingers, feeling how its cold smoothness and heaviness reminded him of something important, as if every turn of the stone was part of a decisive game in which he was the main strategist controlling every step. The lady panicked slightly, realizing that she hadn't had time to tell her brother about her plans, and that he was still unaware of everything that had been going on behind her back, causing her heart to beat anxiously at this unexpected gap in communication. The duchy had a veritable surplus of various magical stones, each with its own unique properties and uses, creating a wide selection for those who could afford to purchase them for their own needs or ambitious goals. The elves and dwarves who favored the use of azure and scarlet stones, which were not only incredibly rare, but also extremely difficult to obtain, prized them for the power and strength they could bring, despite the enormous effort required to acquire them. The noblewoman offered the elf named Haresh a seat and some tea, hoping to create a warmer atmosphere for conversation. But he, with obvious displeasure, rudely refused, preferring only plain water, since tea, in his opinion, was disgusting to his tastes. The man acted so provocatively because he had no intention of appearing to her as a kind and gentle trader, but was prepared to play the role of a tough and determined player who was not going to make concessions easily. Romeo smiled in relief, feeling how things were going much easier with this elf, and her gut feeling was telling her that the conversation would be much more productive and constructive than the conversations she had had with others she had interacted with before. Sitting down at the table, Romeo began to explain that adding crystals to the ointment would make it significantly more effective. 10 times more effective, she said, which would no doubt attract the attention and convince even the most skeptical buyer. The elf raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked with interest where the lady had learned about such an effective way of using these crystals, clearly not expecting such deep knowledge of magic and alchemy from her. The girl, putting the cup of tea on the table, clenched her fingers in a nervous gesture, feeling how excitement was beginning to roll in, but trying to hide her emotions and keep her cool in this important conversation. The maiden tried to convince the interlocutor that using durable stones in his business would bring much more benefit than small stones that quickly lost their effectiveness and became unusable. This was a much more reasonable choice. Furthermore, she continued her speech by claiming that the products created by the mythical race would be in great demand in the market, and everyone without exception would be eager to buy them, as they would undoubtedly become valuable and sought after. Haresh was a little embarrassed and retreated since the lady's offer was indeed advantageous, but for some reason he felt that they were trying to deceive him in some way or hide something important from him that could influence his decision. In addition, the elf did not quite understand how she was going to cooperate with the dwarves, because their culture and values were completely different, and they clearly were not interested in the red magical stones that were so important to her and her plans. The noblewoman, laughing to herself, knew about this fact, but she also did not forget that she had azure stones that could become no less valuable and interesting in the eyes of potential buyers, ensuring her a good profit. Romeo decisively changed the subject, returning to the old topic of trade. She assured that, having received the jewelry, the elf would be able to significantly improve his financial situation, ensuring stability and favorable prospects for the future. After deep thought, Haresh finally decided that he would need to think again and discuss this important issue with his brothers to hear their opinions and make a final decision that would suit everyone. Suddenly, the man remembered that they had a person who urgently needed medical help and whom he, using his powers and knowledge, could try to cure, giving him a chance to recover. The maiden was about to offer her guest a place to sleep, but before she could do so, he suddenly rose from his seat without saying a word and hurried away as if something urgently called him. Approaching the exit, he suddenly turned around, sharply grabbed the air, as if trying to get rid of an invisible weight, and exclaiming that it was stuffy and extremely unpleasant for him to be in the man's house. He blurted out these words with obvious disgust. Another moment, and he disappeared into the dense darkness of the forest that grew right at the foot of the tower, where they had been having important conversations, leaving everyone at a loss, and with questions the answers to which seemed impossible or too difficult to understand. The noblewoman watched the actions of the elf with a slight smile, who behaved so rudely and disrespectfully, not hiding his contempt, that it only fueled her interest and made her think about his motives. As soon as the sound of the stone hitting the table broke the silence, the duke, the future ruler, carefully placed the crystal on the surface, finishing his careful examination of it, trying to understand its meaning and possible use. Gustaf turned to his sister, demanding an explanation, because he had never heard anything about her engaging in trade deals with other races before, which surprised him greatly, because it could affect their future relationship. The fire in the fireplace was burning brightly, its flames illuminating the dark corners of the room, creating an atmosphere of coziness. But at the same time, the fire seemed almost ominous against the background of the tense silence that arose around. The noblewoman could not help but notice how quiet and gloomy her uncle had become, as if his own thoughts were weighing heavily on his soul, and his gaze had become deep and detached, as if he was absorbed in something invisible and important. The lady stood still as a stone statue when she heard the terrible news that Robbie had been found dead. At that moment, her face became like stone, and her mood instantly changed, plunging into a darkness and sorrow that she could not hide. When the aristocrat, unable to contain herself, screamed in horror, the man calmly explained that the young man had been sent into exile, and there, as a result of participating in a passionate fight, he had been killed, which had become a tragic end to his fate. The lady thought to herself that the boy might have deserved his fate despite everything that had happened to him. Outside the window, it was night, dark and endless, its cold shadows seeming to swallow up the whole world around. The girl, in turn, began to explain that the ruby was not just a precious stone, but a magical one, rare and valuable, possessing a power that only a few appreciated, and its value was much higher than just material. Later, they began to discuss the rude elf who had visited them that evening, leaving behind an unpleasant impression. The man's manners and behavior could not help but surprise, because he was clearly not inclined to respect and politeness. It was quite a shock to learn that the small scarlet stone had become their key tool in trading with other races, and its value had grown to such heights that it could now form the basis of their future deals. Gustaf didn't yet ask questions about how his sister knew so much, but deep down, he had many suspicions and thoughts about how else he could use these crystals to his advantage without revealing all the cards. With his finger, he carefully touched the ruby that lay on the table, and it, as if alive, reflected the light in the fire burning with a flame, as if it concealed within itself a power capable of changing many things if used correctly. Romeo stood frozen in the darkness, horrified to hear that Gustaf himself would likely gladly attack the mages if they dared to attack them. His words sounded threatening and made her heart beat faster, as if she sensed danger. The noblewoman lowered her head in shock, her gaze filled with determination, and she firmly stated that this was not what she wanted. She did not seek war, did not seek battles, and did not want blood to be spilled in their struggle for power or resources. Instead, the noblewoman wanted to keep the stones a secret, keeping their existence hidden, and making deals only with trusted people to avoid unnecessary noise, and prevent any threat from those who might use them for their own interests. The young couple sat for some time in silence, and only the faint sounds of the night penetrated the room, creating an atmosphere of lulling calm, but at the same time unclear tension, as if behind this silence there was a storm waiting to break out. The maiden's attention was drawn to her brother's voice, who suddenly addressed her by her full name, and this caused her to feel anxious. Her heart sank, and her thoughts froze, as if these words suddenly tore her out of deep thoughts, causing her to lose touch with reality for a moment. The noblewoman froze again when she was asked about who she really was, what her true intentions were, and what was hidden behind the mask, which was so thin and fragile like a thin fabric that could tear at any moment, revealing her true face. Awkwardly, and with a slight tension in her voice, Romaya answered that she was just his sister, and nothing more, trying to hide the growing anxiety inside that did not give her peace and prevented her from thinking clearly, as if an unknown force was squeezing her soul. They looked at each other in silence, until the nobleman said that the lady knew the truth for sure, and yet she was completely bad at lying, her face betraying every hidden hint, every doubt, despite her efforts to hide behind a mask. After these words, Gustaf sighed tiredly. His shoulders slumped, and he walked towards the exit, but the floor creaked under his steps, as if trying to detain him, as if the room itself did not want to let go of this man who left unresolved questions. Before leaving, he paused, glanced over his shoulder, and quietly asked his relative if she would be able to counterattack if she was hit, as if preparing her in advance for the future trials that might befall her along the way. And so, as soon as he left the room, the door slammed behind him with a dull sound, and silence filled the space with renewed vigor. The echo of its closing rang in the air for a long time, leaving only a cold silence that seemed to swallow everything around. The girl, slightly surprised, sat on the sofa, her thoughts confused, and she tried to understand what exactly her relative meant by such words. The phrase left in her mind a lot of questions that did not give her peace, like a hidden meaning that she could not immediately comprehend. She suddenly remembered their previous conversation, in which she loudly declared that she was no longer going to resign herself to her death. No, she was ready to fight and fight back, taking responsibility for every next step. Fatigue seemed to cover the lady, and unable to restrain herself, she lowered her head onto the back of the sofa, feeling how every movement became heavier, and the pressure of daily worries and tense thoughts consumed her body, forcing her to relax. In order to get to the Count's mansion, she had to use a carriage, and the lady rode slowly along the forest road, enjoying the detachment and solitude that this path gave her. The elf also rode with her, his face as impassive as ever, without a single expression of emotion. He was still handsome, with pointed ears and dark straight hair, like a reflection of eternity. However, instead of remaining in the lady's company, he chose solitude, with the coachman taking his place next to him on the outside of the carriage, leaving the interior space for her, as if there was an invisible wall between them dividing their worlds. Only Gustaf remained in their family estate, and the cold autumn, permeated with an icy breath, was already enveloping everything around, turning the air into an unbearably fresh and piercing one, as if nature itself was preparing for a deep winter sleep. The maiden carefully placed her slipper on the step, preparing to enter the carriage. Her every movement was graceful and confident, despite the inevitable shadow of the unknown that hung over her at that moment, like an invisible threat. When they said goodbye, the brother's face was as calm as ever, but behind this cold expression were hidden anxious thoughts, because inside he was acutely worried about her trying in vain to disguise his worries behind a mask of external equanimity. The blue sky stretched overhead without clouds, and the green leafy roof, caressed by the warm midday light, would soon be transformed into orange hues, like everything around, under the influence of the approaching wind, which would bring the evening coolness. The girl sat in the carriage, absorbed in thoughts of her brother and what awaited her on the road. Inside, her heart was full of anxiety and vague fears, but outwardly she remained calm, as if nothing could disturb her fragile balance. Soon, however, they arrived in another duchy to a count, and the house they arrived at was impressive, huge, with many pavilions hidden behind high walls and green gardens. Together with the elf, Romeo slowly stood up from the carriage, her body still feeling tired from the long journey, and her back aching from the unaccustomed load. but she continued to move forward, resolutely, heading towards home. There they were met by a grown man with bright fiery red hair. His name was Illuminite, and he was a nobleman, with an air that reflected refined strength and power. And in his eyes there was an attentiveness to each visitor. The aristocrat greeted the count with restraint and impeccable politeness. Her manners were impeccable, and her looks were reserved, while the elf stood nearby, his face as inscrutable as ever. Haresh, without wasting time on idle talk, immediately got down to business, asking where the patient who needed to be treated was, his voice sounding firm and confident, reflecting the determination in his intentions. She waved her hand towards the lady and said that the guy should be treated with understanding, because he was not a human, but a member of another race, and therefore his manners might seem rude, but this should not serve as a reason for condemnation. Autumn reigned powerfully in the great estate, where silence and peace permeated every room, creating an atmosphere of peace. They went towards the patient, feeling how the grandeur of the place, its motionless grace, left an inevitable imprint on their actions. The estate was filled with beautiful rooms, with high ceilings, spiral staircases, that created a feeling of airiness and lightness, and spacious halls and bright corridors filled everything around with a feeling of space and freedom. Inside the room there were elegant tables and chairs. Every detail was expensive and refined, and on the table, as if in a sign of refined taste, cups and a teapot were carefully placed, creating an atmosphere of coziness and sophistication. The gentleman waved his hand to the side and ordered the maids to open the windows to air the room a little, since there was too little air inside, and the moisture had frozen in the silence of this noble house. As soon as the windows were opened, the room was filled with bright light, and oxygen entered the chambers, bringing with it a feeling of lightness. The air seemed to have been rebooted, and the atmosphere was filled with a sense of a new beginning, as if the day itself was just beginning life. The elf walked with a quick, confident step into the bedroom of the nobleman's daughter, whose health was in danger and required immediate intervention. She was sitting up in bed, wasted by illness, with a pale face as if she was holding back her weakness with her last strength. Unceremoniously, without showing the slightest sign of patience, the man approached the girl with fiery red hair, and without wasting time, ordered her to extend her hand so that the necessary procedure could be carried out, ignoring her obvious discomfort. Unceremoniously, without a trace of sympathy, the man approached the girl with fiery red hair, his gaze cold and determined. He, without bothering to wait for an answer, ordered her to extend her hand to perform the procedure, ignoring her obvious weakness and discomfort. Stubbornly, with an unyielding expression on his face, the elf asked again in a loud and commanding voice whether the girl had continued to take the medicine prescribed to her. The girl, quietly and reservedly, barely nodding her head, agreed to his demand, not daring to object. Romaya, who was standing next to him, raised one eyebrow in surprise, watching such a harsh and almost cruel interrogation. The woman's gaze combined amazement and hidden displeasure, reflecting bewilderment at how a man was treating a sick child. Turning his head towards the lady, Haresh said loudly that they were faced with a rare and mysterious disease, with a name that was so unfamiliar that it was difficult to explain even to experienced doctors, and the symptoms remained a mystery to everyone. The man, without wasting any time, began to explain that since the little girl often took medications over time, they turned into poison for her, losing all healing power and no longer brought any benefit. The girl folded her hands in front of her, her gaze focused, and her face expressed faint hope, as if she realized that she still had a chance to recover, despite the gravity of the situation. The elf smiled slightly and nodded, confirming his ability to heal her. There was a clear confidence in his gaze, and every movement of his body indicated that he knew exactly how to handle this task. The noblewoman tilted her head slightly to the side. Her gaze was full of slight mystery, and smiling reservedly, she promised that she would pay the man for his services later, but before her words could be finished, she was interrupted by a loud voice. Suddenly, the count intervened, his voice loud and decisive, as if everything depended on it, when he declared that he would gladly pay all the expenses himself, not wishing any outsider to deal with the matter and interfere with his affairs. To this, the representative of another race who possessed extraordinary beauty calmly stated that the count did not need to be paid at all, since he did not need either gold or silver. and a special agreement had been concluded between him and the maiden, which did not imply material compensation. The elf extended his hand forward and asked for a piece of paper to write down instructions for treating the nobleman's daughter, his movements confident and quick, as if he had long been accustomed to such situations. The lady standing nearby watched her friend carefully write down the medical prescription, her gaze attentive, and she herself stood quietly nearby, feeling the importance of the moment when the decision was almost ready. After this, Haresh turned to the aristocrat and said that he would return later to continue his actions, to which Romia promised that she would patiently wait for his return, confident that everything would be done as it should be. The father, when the guests left the estate, joyfully embraced his daughter, expressing his boundless gratitude and happiness that now, thanks to help, her recovery was quite possible, and her suffering seemed to be at an end. At that moment, a young man with fiery red hair approached the beauty, who with sincere gratitude in his eyes thanked her for the help she had provided to his family, recognizing her services to her loved ones. It was the eldest son of the count, who, relying on his honor, took an oath that he would certainly pay all the expenses if his sister recovered, promising to fulfill his duty with due seriousness and responsibility. To this, the lady merely waved her hand, replying with a slight smile that she was simply acting out of kindness, as befits anyone who cares for their subjects, without expecting any gratitude or reward for her actions. Next to the windows, there was a small table surrounded by chairs, and on it stood a tea set. Everything in this corner created an atmosphere of coziness and tranquility, inviting you to enjoy the moment in this quiet and beautiful place. The girl was asked if she would like to drink some wine, but she politely declined, saying that she preferred to remain sober, feeling that it was not the time to relax and enjoy drinks. Realizing that time was of the essence, the count decided to get straight to the point, leaning against the nightstand on which lay expensive things. He asked curiously what exactly she would like to receive as payment for her services and assistance. At this, the noblewoman smiled slightly, bowing her head, and with a slight hint of playfulness, stated that her only wish was to strengthen the friendship between their families, as this would be much more valuable than any material goods. In a cold tone, the nobleman clarified what exactly she was going to do with their so-called friendship, hinting at her true intentions, which could hide far from good goals. A woman's hand with exquisitely curved fingers rested on the back of the sofa, giving her figure elegance and sophistication, while her gaze remained calm despite the tension in the air. The lady suddenly became serious, and with cold determination explained that she planned to use the count's connections to achieve her goals without hiding the fact that her intentions were far from as naive as they might seem at first glance. The aristocrat with the striking red hair was known for his close ties to the criminal underworld, adding to the darkness of his reputation, and he seemed to care little what others might think of it, making no attempt to hide his dark connections. The man could not hide his admiration for the cunning lady who, despite her sophistication, now demanded his help in dubious matters after she had helped his daughter. The stern man, without showing any emotion, answered her briefly and decisively, asking what she would do if he refused to help her with her request, related to the criminal world. Frowning, the girl calmly explained that she was looking for a certain person and that his help in this matter would be extremely important to her. She asked for his assistance, assuring that his support would help her catch this person. The lady, realizing that there was no point in insisting on her own any longer, turned away with restraint, leaving the man in silence, and thought and immersed herself in her own thoughts, allowing silence to fill the space between them. The nobleman, slightly bowing his head, which could be interpreted as a sign of agreement, restrainedly uttered only one word: "Understood." But his face remained completely impassive, as if nothing in this world could disturb his inner peace. In the graceful fingers of the beautiful lady was a note on which were written all the details of the exact person she was looking for. The note was carefully written, as if every stroke carried a special meaning. Before leaving the place, the lady, with a light look full of care and warmth, wished a speedy recovery to his daughter. Her voice was soft and full of sincere compassion, leaving a feeling of warm hope in the air. The carriage moved smoothly, swaying along the road, where golden autumn leaves, like little lights, fell to the ground, creating a beautiful and magical atmosphere that was impossible not to notice. Soon her brother will turn 19, and she is sure that it is then that the moment will come when she will definitely meet that very second main character with whom their destinies will intertwine again and again. The girl clenched her fists, determined, her heart burning with the desire to save the second boy from the terrible clutches of slavery, freeing him. She dreamed of helping him find freedom and a chance at a new life full of hope. Romeo sighed heavily, regretting that she had not written the novel in more detail, because now, after the passage of time, she lacked important information to know exactly where to look for those who were so important to her story. The girl frowned, raised her head up, and at that moment whispered a prayer, asking all the deities to help her find the poor guy, who was so important to her, despite all the difficulties she had to face. The fireplace in the corner was burning brightly, the fire crackling merrily, its light softly illuminating the room, creating an atmosphere of coziness and warmth, as if the fire itself was trying to outshine the cold, and darkness filling the space with light and life. Gustaf, sitting at his desk and signing documents, suddenly looked up when an old friend entered his office with whom he had long been connected, not only by business, but also by deep personal experiences that were ready to manifest themselves again. The man, slightly puzzled, quickly ordered his guard to clarify what was happening to his sister, what her condition was at the moment, because every minute in this situation could play a decisive role in her fate. The knight in the dark cloak raised his head and replied that her sister was fine, but unfortunately, they were unable to catch the elf who was walking with her. He was too fast, and despite their efforts, slipped away, leaving them behind. The young man relaxed his back and leaned back in his chair, sighing heavily, but then still said with a smile that everything was fine. Catching up with the elf was indeed difficult, especially considering his agility, but in the end, it wasn't that important. Before leaving, Romeo promised her brother that she would return, but not just like that, but with a gentle and warm smile that would once again bring light and comfort to their common home, where they would all return someday. However, the future Duke continued to be very worried about the safety of his relative, despite her steadfastness, because his heart did not allow him to calm down, knowing that at any moment she could be in danger, and he must be ready to protect. Although she behaved with restraint and confidence, she still retained that same spirit of persistence and zeal inherent in naive youth, which, despite experience, sometimes risked going where a hidden threat could await her. The man, feeling the tension making it difficult to breathe, barely adjusted his tie to ease his breathing, but even this gesture could not completely dispel his anxiety, which did not leave his thoughts, making his heart beat faster. The lady was chosen by the almighty blue flame that surrounded her as a sign of greatness and power, and at that moment she was dressed in a black veil that hid her face, and the fire, like a living creature, swirled around her, creating a mystical atmosphere. The young man, with a thoughtful expression on his face, waved his hand to his oprichnik, ordering him to urgently find out what the Count would do after his sister left this place, because he knew that important events were hidden behind every step of the Count. This man was part of a group of informants who knew their job well and always got the information they needed, even if it required the utmost caution and secrecy so as not to attract unnecessary attention. The professional in his field bowed his head and looked with respect at the future Duke, accepting his order, because in his eyes there was no doubt. This was not just a duty, it was a desire to complete the task at the highest level. The young man learned about these informants from his mother, and therefore it is unlikely that his sister would have known about them, since these secret connections, and everything connected with them, were hidden from her prying eyes so as not to jeopardize their family affairs. If Romeo had not become the head of the clan, then the Green Shadow Legion, as an organized being, would not exist. Their structure would never have arisen, and all the undertakings and plans on which she founded this force would have sunk into oblivion. This organization was able to exist only thanks to the finances that came from their family, because without this flow of resources that supported all activities, the Legion would not have been able to strengthen its position and grow to such a scale. Suddenly, a loud knock on the door broke the silence, and a strange but clear voice penetrated the space, announcing that Romeo had finally returned home. The words seemed to break the calm, filling the moment with special meaning. The night shrouded the earth in thick shadows, and dark clouds hid the entire sky, leaving only space for the majestic full and round moon, which hung in the very center, its light piercing the darkness, creating an atmosphere of mystical mystery around. Romeo appeared in a new silk dress, its fabric flowing softly over her figure, and looking with interest at her brother, she asked if he had already had dinner, because it was important for her to know how he spent this evening in her absence. After that, the noblewoman looked at Gustaf with a soft and mysterious smile on her lips. Her gaze was full of playful interest, and with a light tone, she quietly asked if he was really waiting for her so much to enjoy a meal in her company. The man, without showing any emotion on his face, only nodded quietly in agreement with his relative, exchanging a brief glance with her full of hidden thoughts and feelings barely noticeable to an outsider's eye. The two of them headed to the dining room, where a huge table appeared before them, replete with various dishes that looked so appetizing that each piece literally beckoned to itself, making them forget about everything else. With a sharp movement, with a hint of annoyance, she took a knife and carefully cut slices of butter, after which, with a confident, almost commanding tone, she said that soon an elf would come to them again who intended to make his visit. The fork and knife deftly spread the soft butter over the golden toast, creating a perfect layer, and the sesame seeds added a unique flavor, filling this moment with pleasant harmony and ecstatic sensations. Taking a cup of hot tea, Gustaf took a slow sip, enjoying the warmth of the drink, and thoughtfully noted to himself that the lady should have eaten more. After all, despite her fatigue, she had worked too hard. Suddenly, like a clap of thunder, there was a sharp knock at the window, and the curtains fluttering in the night air covered part of the glass, absorbing the light of the streetlights. Behind them, the darkness thickened, and the mysterious guest walked into this darkness like a ghost concealing the unknown. The man stood up from his seat in irritation, and the lady sitting nearby was clearly at a loss for words. She remained motionless, caught in confusion, carefully watching every movement of her brother, who seemed to be waiting for something important that would change the course of events. It was the elf who came to the noblewoman and extended his hand to her, restraining his pride. He, without hiding his insistence, said that he wanted to receive his payment for the work done, otherwise his patience would run out. Without blinking, the noblewoman waved her hand, as if she was tired of unnecessary words, and with cold determination said that the guy should wait a minute. The reward would be delivered to him, and she would personally make sure that everything was done as it should be. The door creaked open quietly, and the girl, like a shadow, instantly disappeared from the room, leaving behind only a barely noticeable trace in the air, which soon dissolved into the deep darkness, as if she had never existed. When she returned, her hands, now carefully clutching a small silver chest, radiated confidence. Inside, carefully wrapped in velvet, lay a scarlet stone, a ruby whose fiery brilliance beckoned to it. The elf, having carefully examined the gem, nodded in satisfaction, his gaze full of determination and understanding, as if he knew that this gift contained much more than just material value and harbored some deep power. With a slight smile on her face, Romeo, feeling a glimmer of hope in her chest, mentally decided that their paths would cross again, and it would be nice if it happened not for business, but for a more pleasant reason. The balcony door opened, and the elf, like a shadow, disappeared again, disappearing into the silence of the night and quickly disappearing into the forest, as if he had not been there, leaving only a mysterious feeling of his presence. Intrigued, Gustaf couldn't help but ask how his sister planned to establish trade with another race that looked like elves, and what specific steps she was taking to make it successful and profitable for all parties. The girl, without hesitation, replied that, in order to successfully resolve this issue, she would work with an association of magicians that possessed significant resources, including rare and valuable ores, which would greatly simplify the fulfillment of their tasks and open up new opportunities. The future duke invited the lady to accompany him to an important business meeting, but she politely declined, which clearly disappointed him. He could not come to terms with the idea of letting his sister go alone, especially considering the possible security risks. Not wanting to let this go unnoticed, he gave her strict orders to be sure to mention the blue magic stone in her letter to the other race, hoping that it would add weight to their request and strengthen their business relationship. Soon, a dwarf came to visit them, with a staff that seemed too big for his small stature, and trembling all over. He froze on the threshold as if he could not decide to enter his eyes, darting about in search of some signal. The guy, noticing the dwarf's awkwardness, quickly approached him, slightly bowing his head as a sign of respect, and confidently said that he would soon return with a response from the Association of Magicians, assuring that everything would be done on time and with the necessary care. Having decided that this time they would go together, Gustaf began to massage his neck with his hands, feeling how stiff and sore it was after sitting for a long time. The tension did not go away, and he could not get rid of the discomfort. After a few minutes of trying to ease the pain, he removed his chain from around his neck, on which hung a ring with the precious stone of his family. The stone sparkled in the dim light, reflecting all the power and significance of his family history. Gustaf, noticing his sister's anxiety, tried to calm her down, saying with a confident intonation that there was no need to worry too much. Then, with a gentle expression on his face, he carefully placed the jewelry, a ring with a precious stone, on his sister's finger. The jewel, an exquisite blue stone, shone magnificently on the lady's finger, attracting attention with its beauty and mystery, as if reflecting the depth of her soul and the mystical aura that surrounded her every step. When asked how the future duke would cope without the ring, he simply waved it off with a slight smile, answering that everything would be perfectly fine. And despite the temporary absence of this important symbol, nothing would interfere with his plans and determination. Giving a gentle kiss to his sister's hand, he blessed her as if passing on some of his power, through his gaze, filled with the promise of protection, and the power of the blue fire that was felt in the air, like magic permeating the moment. Romeo was embarrassed by such words, because despite their tenderness, she could not forget that Gustaf was not only the main character of all the events, but also a real handsome man whose presence always attracted glances. Before going out, the aristocrat decided to change her outfit for a strict black formal suit, which was ideal for such an important occasion, and she looked incredibly elegant in it, like the embodiment of impeccable taste and confidence.